In the scorching summer of 479 BC, the legendary gardens of Persepolis were not merely a stage for celebration. They were a lie, a magnificent, shimmering, golden lie designed to blind the world to a terrifying truth. If you were standing there, amidst the towering columns of black stone and the scent of jasmine heavy in the thick air, you would have seen a paradise. You would have seen the greatest empire the world had ever known at the height of its luxury. But history tells us that sometimes the brightest lights are lit only to cast the deepest shadows. Why would the most powerful man on earth, a man worshipped as a god, need to hide behind a desperate wall of noise, perfume, and intoxication? And what was he so afraid that you and I would see? To understand the tragedy that is about to unfold, a tragedy that will destroy an innocent life and shake the foundations of a dynasty, we must first look past the silk curtains and the gold platters. We must look at the wound they were trying to cover. This was not just a party, it was a mask. A mask crafted from the finest gold of Lydia, the rarest perfumes of Arabia, and the hypnotic music of 100 conquered nations. It was a mask designed to conceal the open, bleeding wound of the Persian Empire. For 7 days and 7 nights, the royal palace of Persepolis had been transformed into a theater of the absurd, a place where the grandeur of Persia was commanded to shine brighter than its recent, humiliating darkness. Xerxes, the king of kings, the great king, the ruler of the earth from India to Ethiopia, had returned home. But he did not return as a conqueror leading a train of spoils and slaves. He returned as a survivor of his own ambition. He had just arrived from his failed campaign against Greece, a military disaster that still burns in the pages of history books today. He had watched his invincible fleet shatter against the wooden walls of the Greeks at the Battle of Salamis. He had seen his elite infantry, the Immortals, ground into the dust at the Battle of Plataea. For a man whose power was absolute, whose word was law, and whose image was divinity, admitting an error was not just a political mistake. It was an existential threat. To admit failure was to destroy the myth that held his empire together. And so, this banquet. It was not a festivity born of joy. It was a declaration of survival. It was a message sent to every satrap, every general, and every potential traitor whispering in the shadows, "The empire is intact, and so am I." Thousands of guests from every corner of the vast Achaemenid territories flooded the colossal halls. Imagine the scene. The architecture of Persepolis was designed to make humans feel small, and on these nights, it did its job well. The walls were draped in heavy Babylonian tapestries, woven with threads of silver and lapis lazuli, depicting lions and bulls in eternal combat, symbols of strength that rang hollow to those who knew the truth of the recent wars. The air was thick, almost unbreathable, filled with the smoke of frankincense burning in massive braziers, fighting a losing battle against the heat of the Iranian summer. But the most striking detail, the one that the chroniclers of the time made sure to record, was the excess. It was an aggressive, violent abundance. The stone fountains in the courtyards, usually reserved for cooling waters, had been drained and refilled. They did not spout water, they bled wine. Rivers of dark, sweet vintage from the vineyards of Shiraz flowed endlessly. A crimson tide meant to wash away the memory of the blood spilled in the Aegean Sea. Musicians sat in the shadows between the fluted columns, playing melodies from lands that Persia still held in its iron grip. Egypt, Bactria, Assyria. Their music was a political statement, a sonic map of the empire, reminding everyone that despite the Greek stubbornness, Xerxes still owned the world. Dancers spun between the guests, their movements hypnotic, their bodies adorned with jewels that caught the flickering torchlight, creating a kaleidoscope of distraction. Yet, there was a desperate edge to it all. The laughter was too loud, the applause too exaggerated, the drinking too frantic. The abundance had a singular, tactical purpose: to distract, to dazzle, and to anesthetize. It was anesthesia for a court that was terrified. In every raised goblet, in every toast to the king's eternal health, there hid the shadow of military failure. The courtiers drank not to celebrate, but to forget that the edges of the map were burning. And in the center of it all, seated on his elevated throne, sat Xerxes. He was a figure of breathtaking splendor. His beard was oiled and curled in the Assyrian fashion. His robes were dyed the deep, impossible purple that cost a fortune per ounce, and his crown sat heavy on his brow. He observed the chaos he had ordered. He smiled, he nodded, and he drank. He drank to forget the burning ships at Salamis. He drank to silence the screams of his dying soldiers that surely echoed in his mind when the music stopped. He looked like a god, distant and untouchable. But beneath the silk, he was a man consumed by insecurity. He did not know it yet, but this desperation to prove his power was about to lead him to a decision far more catastrophic than any lost battle. You see, empires rarely fall because of enemy armies. We like to think of history as a series of great battles, of swords and shields clashing on open fields. But the true collapse often begins much closer to home. Empires fall because of decisions that seem insignificant in the moment they are taken. They fall because of a whisper, a glance, a moment of drunken pride. The rot starts from the head. This specific rot began on the third day of the banquet. The novelty of the wine fountains had worn off. The heat was oppressive, and the initial euphoria was settling into a heavy, dangerous stupor. The king, intoxicated not only by the free-flowing wine but by a sudden, surging sense of recovered omnipotence, allowed his gaze to wander. He was looking for something, anything that would confirm his dominion. His eyes drifted over the generals who had failed him, the satraps who secretly despised him, and finally rested on a figure of striking grace moving among the women. The celebration was reaching a fever pitch, the boundary between reality and delirium blurring with every passing hour. The music swelled, a rhythmic, driving beat that seemed to pulse in time with the heat of the night. In that fugue state, Xerxes felt the need to exert control, to possess, to demonstrate that everything in this hall, every object, every drop of wine, and every beating heart belonged to him. He was not just a king recovering from a loss. He was a man trying to fill a void where his glory used to be. And history warns us, when a powerful man tries to fill a void with the lives of others, tragedy is inevitable. The mask of Persepolis was slipping, and underneath, the face of the empire was grimacing. But the guests kept dancing, the wine kept flowing, and the king kept watching, unaware that he was about to set in motion a series of events that would stain his hands with a guilt no amount of wine could ever wash away. The stage was set. The actors were in place. The tragedy of the house of Xerxes was about to begin, not with a roar of anger, but with a smile. To comprehend the disaster that was about to befall the house of Achaemenes, we must first dismantle the image of the man sitting at the center of the storm. We must peel back the layers of gold, the embroidered silk, and the terrifying reputation to look at Xerxes not as a deity, but as a man. In the ancient world, the title King of Kings was not merely a poetic honorific. It was a statement of cosmic reality. It implied that this single human being was the pivot upon which the known universe turned. The Persians did not just obey their king. They breathed because he allowed it. His health was the health of the harvest. His strength was the stability of the mountains. His will was the law of nature itself. But there is a terrible fragility inherent in being a god on earth. When you are positioned as the sun, you cannot afford to flicker. You cannot dim, and you certainly cannot be seen bleeding. Yet, Xerxes was bleeding, not physically, but spiritually. The wound inflicted upon his psyche by the Greeks was festering. Imagine the psychological dissonance of this man. He had been raised from birth to believe in his own invincibility. He was the son of Darius the Great, the heir to Cyrus. He had bridged the Hellespont with ships. He had carved canals through mountains. He had marched an army so vast it was said to drink rivers dry. And yet, this irresistible force had been stopped by a collection of squabbling city-states on the rocky edge of the world. The defeat at Salamis was not just a military loss, it was a theological crisis. If the king was the agent of Ahura Mazda, the god of truth and order, then how could he fail? Failure implied that the lie the Drauga had won. Failure implied that the king was mortal. And for a man like Xerxes, admitting mortality was the first step toward assassination. In the cutthroat world of the Persian court, a weak king was a dead king. This explains the manic intensity of the banquet. It was a piece of theater designed to rewrite reality. If he could not conquer Greece with swords, he would conquer the doubts of his own people with overwhelming, suffocating luxury. The scale of the event was designed to induce vertigo. For 7 days, the boundaries of the palace were dissolved. The Apadana, the great audience hall with its forest of 36 columns, became the dining room of the empire. These columns, soaring 20 meters into the air, topped with double-headed bulls, were designed to make every human being standing beneath them feel like an insect. And that was the point. The architecture of Persepolis was an architecture of intimidation. It screamed, "You are small, and I am great." Into this hall, Xerxes poured the wealth of the world. The chroniclers tell us that the walls were draped in hangings brought from Babylon, tapestries so thick and intricate that a single panel took a team of weavers years to complete. They depicted mythical beasts, winged lions, and griffins, creatures that belonged to a world of magic, reinforcing the idea that the king lived in a realm above the mundane. The tables groaned under the weight of the empire's tribute. There was gold from Sardis, hammered into cups so delicate they felt like paper in the hand. There was silver from Egypt, ivory from Ethiopia, and lapis lazuli from the distant mines of Bactria. The food itself was a map of conquest. Guests dined on ostrich from the deserts of Arabia, fish salted and brought from the Mediterranean, and fruits preserved in honey from the orchards of Damascus. To eat at the king's table was to eat the world itself. But notice the specific nature of this luxury. It was excessive to the point of nausea. It was too much. The air was too perfumed, masking the smell of unwashed bodies and fear. The music was too loud, drowning out the whispers. The wine was too strong. This was the anatomy of a god-king in crisis, a desperate overcompensation. Xerxes sat above it all, trapped in his own performance. We can imagine his internal monologue as he looked out over the sea of faces, thousands of satraps, generals, eunuchs, and nobles. These were men who owed him everything. Yet he knew, with the paranoia that plagues all autocrats, that they were judging him. When he looked at a general, did he see loyalty? Or did he see a man remembering the retreat from Plataea? When he looked at a satrap, did he see a servant? Or a man calculating the tax revenue lost in the failed war? The banquet was an act of aggression against memory. Every goblet of wine poured was an attempt to wash away the image of burning ships. Every bite of exotic meat was a distraction from the hunger of the retreating army. Xerxes was trying to build a wall of pleasure so high that no one could see the ruins behind it. But the most dangerous element of this anatomy was the isolation. Despite being surrounded by thousands, Xerxes was entirely alone. A king of kings has no peers. He has no friends. He cannot turn to a counselor and say, "I am afraid I have ruined us." He cannot turn to his wife and say, "I feel small today." To speak those words is to abdicate. So, he suppresses. He locks the fear inside a cage of iron discipline. But repressed emotion is a volatile substance. It builds pressure. And in the heat of that Persian summer, fueled by alcohol and the exhausting effort of maintaining the facade, Xerxes was a vessel on the verge of cracking. He needed an outlet. He needed to prove in a tangible, undeniable way that he was still the master of fate. He needed to grant a boon, to bestow a gift, to exercise the godlike power of changing a life with a single word. This psychological state, this toxic cocktail of insecurity, absolute power, and isolation, is what made the atmosphere in the hall so electric and so dangerous. The guests felt it too. There is a specific kind of tension that fills a room when a violent man is drinking to forget. The laughter becomes brittle. People watch the king's hands, they watch his eyes. If he smiles, the room roars with relief. If he frowns, the silence is deafening. They were walking on a knife's edge. The great king was looking for a way to reassert his dominance, not over armies this time, but over the people right in front of him. He wanted to remind them that while he might have lost Greece, here, in Persepolis, he was still the author of their reality. And amidst this grand, terrified, shimmering assembly, the machinery of the empire ground on. Servants moved like ghosts, refilling cups before they were empty. The heat of the torches mixed with the heat of the bodies, creating a stifling, dreamlike haze. The sensory overload was complete. The logic of the daylight world had been suspended. In this twilight of gold and wine, normal rules did not apply. Xerxes shifted on his throne. The gold of his jewelry felt heavy, hot against his skin. He looked at the faces below him, faces that were masks reflecting his own. He hated them. He needed them. He wanted to shock them. He wanted to do something that would make them gasp. Something that would remind them that his generosity was as terrifying as his wrath. He did not know that the opportunity to do so was about to dance into the room. He did not know that his desire to feel powerful was about to collide with the innocence of his own blood. The anatomy of the God King was complete. A heart full of fear, a hand full of power, and a mind clouded by the desperate need to be worshipped. The stage was set for the collapse, and all it required was a single, beautiful spark to ignite the powder keg that Xerxes had become. While the King of Kings drank to drown the memory of burning ships, and while the generals plotted in hushed tones over cups of Shiraz wine, a different world existed just beyond the heavy cedar doors of the banquet hall. It was a world of silence, scent, and secrets. To understand the victim of this tragedy, we must leave the noise of the Apadana and step into the Anderuni, the inner sanctum, the royal harem. If the banquet hall was a theater of war disguised as a party, the harem was a factory disguised as a paradise. Western history has often eroticized this space, painting it as a playground of hedonism and lazy indulgence. But the reality of the Achaemenid court was far colder and far more calculated. The harem was a political institution, a machine carefully calibrated to produce two things: heirs for the throne and alliances for the empire. In this cloistered world, hidden from the gaze of common men, lived a mistress. She was 14 years old. In the chronology of the ancient world, she was a woman grown, ready for marriage. But in the eyes of history, she was still a child, a pawn unaware of the game board on which she stood. A mistress was not merely a girl, she was a product of rigorous design. From the moment she could walk, she had been molded by the hands of eunuchs and the sharp whispers of older concubines. She was the daughter of the great king, and that title carried a weight that crushed ordinary childhoods. Her life was a tapestry of strict protocols. She was taught that her face was a currency, her voice a melody to soothe powerful men, and her womb a vessel for the future. She learned to weave intricate patterns with gold thread, a skill prized among Persian nobility, not just as a hobby but as a discipline of patience and precision. She learned to play the harp, her fingers calloused from hours of practice, ensuring that every note was perfect enough to please a god. But above all, she learned the art of submission. This was not the submission of a slave, broken by the whip. It was the submission of a statue, perfect, silent, and motionless until moved by its owner. A mistress was taught that her will was secondary to the needs of the dynasty. She was a thread in the great Persian rug, and threads do not ask where they are being woven. On this particular night, the third night of the great banquet, the air in the harem was thick with tension. The noise from the main hall drifted through the stone corridors like the rumble of a distant storm. The women knew that the king was in a volatile mood. They knew the wine was flowing too freely. And when the heavy doors of the women's quarters swung open, revealing the tall, hairless figures of the royal eunuchs, a ripple of fear passed through the room. They had not come for a concubine. They had not come for a dancer from the lower ranks. They had come for the princess. The summons was irregular, highly irregular. Daughters of the royal blood did not typically perform for the drunken masses of the court. They were kept hidden, their value preserved for high-stakes diplomatic marriages. To bring a mistress out, to display her before the leering eyes of satraps and soldiers, was a breach of protocol that signaled just how desperate Xerxes was to impress his guests. He was throwing every treasure he had onto the table, including his own flesh and blood. A mistress did not question the order. She had been trained not to. As the eunuchs waited with stone-faced patience, her attendants rushed to prepare her. This preparation was a ritual in itself, a transformation from human girl to divine symbol. They bathed her skin in rosewater brought from the gardens of Gamsar, scenting her so heavily that she smelled like a walking flower. They darkened her eyes with kohl, widening them until they looked like the eyes of a gazelle, startled, beautiful, and vulnerable. They dressed her in the finest silks, dyed a soft, shimmering blue that recalled the morning sky over the Zagros mountains. Gold bracelets were snapped onto her slender wrists, and a necklace of heavy pearls was fastened around her throat. Each piece of jewelry was a masterpiece of the empire's craftsmen, but as they were placed upon her, they looked less like ornaments and more like the decorations on a sacrificial offering. When she was ready, she looked into a polished bronze mirror. What looked back was not a 14-year-old girl with dreams and fears. What looked back was the daughter of Xerxes, an icon of perfection. She took a deep breath, smoothing the silk over her heart, which beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was terrified, but her face was a mask of serene obedience. The walk from the harem to the Apadana was a journey between worlds. She moved through the long, torch-lit corridors, flanked by her eunuch guards. With every step, the air changed. The cool, perfumed silence of the women's quarters gave way to the hot, heavy stench of the banquet, the smell of roasted meat, spilled wine, and thousands of sweating bodies. The noise grew from a murmur to a roar. When they reached the massive double doors of the audience hall, the guards paused. A mistress stood in the shadow of the threshold. Beyond those doors lay the heart of the empire, a room filled with the men who ruled the world. And at the far end, raised on his golden dais, sat her father. She loved him with the fierce, blind devotion of a daughter who knows only his greatness. She believed he had summoned her because he was proud of her. She believed she was there to bring beauty to his celebration. She did not know that, to him, she was just another prop in his desperate play for validation. The doors groaned open. The light hit her first, a blinding glare from 1,000 oil lamps reflecting off the gold walls. Then came the silence. As she stepped into the vast hall, the roar of conversation died away. Thousands of eyes turned toward her. It was a physical weight. This sudden, collective gaze. The generals, the satraps, the foreign dignitaries, they all stopped mid-drink, captivated by the vision that had appeared at the entrance. Amestris walked forward. Her movements were fluid, practiced, graceful. She did not look at the crowd. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, on the intricate patterns of the stone. Just as she had been taught, she moved toward the throne, a small, shimmering figure in a cavern of giants. The musicians, sensing the shift in the room, changed their tempo. The raucous drinking songs faded, replaced by a delicate, haunting melody from a lone harp, and Amestris began to dance. It was not a dance of seduction that would have been beneath her station. It was a dance of elegance, of harmony. She moved like water, her silk robes flowing around her, her hands weaving stories in the air. It was a performance meant to embody the sophistication of the Persian court, to show these rough men of war that beauty and order still existed at the heart of the empire. To the guests, she was breathtaking, a vision of youth and purity in a room stained by failure and excess. But to Xerxes, watching from his high throne through a haze of wine, she was something else. She was proof that his blood was superior, proof that he could command the most beautiful things in the world. As he watched her spin, a dangerous mixture of pride and ownership swelled in his chest. He felt generous. He felt godlike. He looked at the faces of his guests and saw their envy, their awe, and it fed his starving ego. "Look," his mind whispered. "Look at what I have created." Amestris spun, her eyes momentarily catching the light, shining with the exertion of the dance. She was doing everything right. She was perfect. She was making her father proud. She could not hear the thoughts of the man sitting next to the throne, the old General Artabanus, whose eyes were not filled with awe, but with a cold, calculating hunger. She could not hear the gears of fate grinding into motion. She ended her dance in a deep bow, her forehead touching the cool stone floor, her silk pooling around her like a spilled drink. The room exploded in applause. It was a thunderous sound, a wave of adulation that washed over her. She rose, breathless, a shy smile touching her lips, waiting for her father's nod of approval. But Xerxes did not just nod. He stood up, swaying slightly, clutching his golden goblet. The King of Kings raised a hand to silence the room. The applause died instantly. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with the unpredictability of a drunk monarch. Xerxes looked down at his daughter, his eyes bright with a manic intensity. He wanted to reward her. He wanted to show the world the scale of his magnificence. He opened his mouth, and with a few slurred words, he prepared to turn a moment of beauty into a lifetime of horror. The dance was over. The trap was sprung. There is an old Persian proverb that says, "An arrow once loosed cannot be called back. A word once spoken cannot be unsaid." We often think of history being shaped by the clash of steel, by the thunder of cavalry charges, or by the burning of cities. But how often do we consider the destructive power of a single sentence? How often do we stop to realize that empires can be dismantled not by the sword, but by the tongue? At this moment, in the sweltering heat of the Persepolis banquet hall, the arrow was about to be loosed. The bow was drawn by a king who could no longer distinguish between his own divine myth and the fragile reality of his human limitations. And the target, though he did not know it yet, was his own heart. The banquet had now bled into its third day. The structured elegance of the beginning had dissolved into a chaotic, rhythmic stupor. The air in the Apadana was no longer just perfumed. It was stale, heavy with the breath of thousands of men, the sour tang of spilled wine, and the smoke of dying torches. The musicians played on, their fingers moving automatically, their eyes glazed with exhaustion. The dancers spun with less precision, their movements slightly lagging behind the beat. The entire hall was a collective organism teetering on the edge of collapse, held together only by the sheer force of the king's presence. And Xerxes? Xerxes was soaring. The applause for his daughter's dance still rang in his ears like a hymn of worship. He looked down at Amestris, who was bowing low, a pool of blue silk on the black stone. In his wine-soaked mind, her perfection was his perfection. Her grace was his grace. He felt a surge of overwhelming, magnanimous love, not the quiet, protective love of a father, but the loud, performative love of a narcissist who sees his children as extensions of his own glory. He wanted to capture this feeling. He wanted to crystallize this moment of adoration and freeze it in time. He needed to do something grand, something that would prove to every skeptical general in the room that he was not the defeated failure of Salamis, but the benevolent, all-powerful provider of the Achaemenid world. He stood up. The motion was abrupt. His golden robes rustled loudly in the sudden hush that fell over the room. When a king of kings stands, the world sits. The laughter died in throats. Goblets were lowered to tables with soft clinks. The silence that swept through the hall was absolute, terrified, and expectant. Thousands of eyes fixed on him, trying to read the weather in his face. Was he angry? Was he sick? Was he about to order an execution? Xerxes swayed slightly, gripping the arm of his throne for balance. His eyes swept across the sea of faces, the faces of men he owned. He smiled, a loose, dangerous smile that did not quite reach his eyes. He raised his heavy gold rhyton, the wine sloshing dangerously close to the rim. "My people," his voice boomed, amplified by the acoustics of the great hall. Slightly slurred but undeniably powerful. "You have seen the beauty of my house. You have tasted the bounty of my table." But the generosity of Xerxes does not end with bread and wine. He gestured grandly toward the room, his hand encompassing the generals, the satraps, the eunuchs, and the distant relatives. He felt the rush of power, the intoxicating drug of being the one who gives. "This celebration is a testament to our strength," he continued, his voice rising. "And on this night, I wish to demonstrate the boundlessness of my favor. Let it be known that I, Xerxes, King of kings, King of lands, King of this earth, far and wide, am in a giving mood." The courtiers exchanged glances. A gift from the king was a rare and dangerous thing. It usually came with strings attached, or it was a test. But Xerxes was not finished. He was riding the wave of his own rhetoric now. He looked around for a focal point, someone to be the recipient of this performative generosity. He needed a prop for his play. And then, he made the mistake that would doom them all. He didn't choose a specific person to reward. He chose the concept of the reward itself. He fell in love with the idea of the royal promise. "I swear," he bellowed, his voice echoing off the stone bulls high above, "by the holy light of Ahura Mazda, by the sacred fire that burns eternally, and by the glory of my ancestors, that I shall grant a boon." The mention of the gods changed the atmosphere instantly. This was no longer a drunken toast. In the Persian tradition, invoking the name of the creator, Ahura Mazda, transformed a statement into a binding cosmic contract. To break such an oath was to invite the drauga, the lie, into one's soul. It was to forfeit one's right to rule. A king who broke a sacred oath was no longer a king. He was an agent of chaos. The room grew tense. The air felt charged with static. "Ask," Xerxes shouted, throwing his arms wide, looking at the faces in the front row. "Ask what you will. Let one among you step forward and name his desire. Be it land, be it gold, be it the governance of a province. I swear by the salt and the earth, it shall be yours." It was madness. It was the kind of sweeping, unchecked promise that belongs in fairy tales, not in the brutal arena of imperial politics. A wise king promises specific things to specific people in exchange for specific services. A drunk king promises anything to anyone for the sake of applause. Why did he do it? Historians and psychologists have debated this for centuries. Was it simply the wine? Or was it a deep-seated need to prove that his resources were infinite? After the losses in Greece, perhaps he needed to feel that he could still afford to give away the world. He was trying to buy back his own sense of omnipotence, but in doing so, he had handed a loaded weapon to the room. Imagine the thoughts racing through the minds of the men present. Ask what you will. The possibilities were dizzying. A man could ask for a mountain of gold. He could ask for the head of his rival. He could ask for a satrapy that generated millions in tax revenue. The greed in the room was palpable. It was a physical taste in the mouth, metallic and sharp. However, most men in that hall were smart enough to be afraid. They knew that this was a trap. To ask for too much would be to insult the king, perhaps even to threaten him. To ask for too little would be to insult his generosity. It was a test of diplomacy. Who would be brave enough or foolish enough to step into the spotlight and test the limits of the king's intoxicated vow? The silence stretched. It was an uncomfortable, heavy silence. The king stood there, beaming, waiting for his benevolence to be accepted. He looked like a benevolent father waiting for his children to open their presents. He did not see the wolves circling, and then, movement. From the shadows of the colonnade, a figure stirred. It was not a young, hot-headed soldier looking for glory. It was not a greedy merchant looking for tax exemptions. It was a man who moved with the slow, deliberate stiffness of age. A man who had sat silently through the dancing, watching not with joy, but with calculation. The crowd parted. They knew him. They feared him. It was Artabanus. He walked toward the throne, his steps echoing on the stone. He did not look drunk. He looked like the only sober man in a world gone mad. He stopped at the foot of the dais and looked up at Xerxes. There was no adoration in his eyes, only a cold, predatory recognition of an opportunity that would never come again. Xerxes beamed down at him. Artabanus, my loyal servant, my father's trusted general, you surely have a desire? Name it, and let the empire witness my gratitude. The king thought he was safe. Artabanus was family, in a way the commander of the royal guard, a fixture of the court. Surely he would ask for a new estate, or a title, or perhaps a ceremonial honor. Xerxes leaned forward, ready to grant the wish and bask in the applause. But Artabanus didn't speak immediately. He let the silence hang there, letting the weight of the oath settle into the stone of the palace. He looked at the king, then his eyes drifted just for a second to the side, where the young amestris was still standing, her blue silk dress shimmering in the torchlight. The trap was not just set, the jaws were already closing. Have you ever made a promise in a moment of high emotion that you later regretted? A promise made when you were too happy, too sad, or too proud? Now imagine that promise wasn't just a regret, but a death sentence for someone you loved. Imagine that the words you spoke couldn't be taken back because the gods themselves were holding you to them. Xerxes was about to learn that the most dangerous thing a king can do is not to lose a war, but to open his mouth. In a forest of screaming peacocks, there was one silent vulture. While the rest of the court dissolved into a chaotic swirl of wine, laughter, and sycophancy, Artabanus stood perfectly still, to understand the gravity of the crime that was about to be committed, because, make no mistake, this was a crime disguised as a wedding proposal. We must step into the mind of the man who stood at the foot of the throne. Artabanus was a relic, in a court that was increasingly obsessed with youth, beauty, and the soft luxuries of peace. He was a monument to a harder, bloodier era. He was over 60 years old, a staggering age in a time when infection or a stray arrow usually claimed men before their 40th winter. His face was a map of the empire's history, etched with the deep lines of exposure to the Afghan wind, the Egyptian sun, and the salt spray of the Aegean. He had served Darius the Great, the father of Xerxes. He had seen the empire when it was forged in fire and discipline. Now, he looked at Xerxes, a man who wore too much gold, drank too much wine, and cared too much about applause, and he felt a cold, calcified contempt. But Artabanus was not a man to let emotion cloud his judgment. He was a survivor, and survivors know that the most dangerous place to be is standing next to a falling king. He knew something that the young poets and the dancing girls did not. In the Persian court, loyalty is a seasonal commodity. He was the commander of the royal guard, the Hazarapat. He held the keys to the palace. He controlled the men who guarded the king's sleep. He was, largely, the second most powerful man in the empire. But he was also afraid. Fear is a strange motivator for a man who has killed hundreds of enemies in battle. Artabanus did not fear death by the sword. That was a soldier's professional hazard. He feared irrelevance. He feared the purge. He knew that when a king fails, as Xerxes had failed in Greece, the knives eventually come out. Scapegoats are needed. Generals are blamed. Old advisors are replaced by young favorites who whisper poison in the king's ear. Artabanus looked at his own hands, weathered and strong, resting on the hilt of his ceremonial dagger. He had no royal blood. He was a Hyrcanian, a noble, yes, but not of the Achaemenid line. In the eyes of the dynasty, he was a servant, a high-ranking servant, but a servant nonetheless. If Xerxes decided tomorrow that Artabanus was a threat, or simply an annoyance, the general could be erased, his lands confiscated, His name struck from the records. His life ended with a silken cord around the neck. He needed insurance. He needed a shield that no blade could penetrate. And in the ancient world, the only shield stronger than steel was blood. If he could fuse his own lineage with the divine blood of the Achaemenids, he would become untouchable. He would no longer be just a general. He would be family. And in the tribal clan-based logic of the Persian nobility, you do not kill your own kin without risking the wrath of the gods and the destabilization of the state. This was the calculation running through his mind as the king's drunken promise echoed in the hall. Ask what you will. Artabanus' eyes shifted to Amestris. It is crucial that we strip away any modern romantic notions from this moment. When Artabanus looked at the 14-year-old princess, he did not see a girl. He did not see her beauty, or her youth, or her terror. He did not feel lust in the way a common soldier might. He felt the cold, dry hunger of ambition. He saw her as an object, a key, a seal of legitimacy. To him, Amestris was a piece of political technology. Her womb carried the potential for grandchildren who would be cousins to the future king. Her presence in his house would elevate his status above every other satrap in the room. Marrying her was not a matter of the heart. It was a hostile takeover. It was a way to anchor his aging, vulnerable body to the bedrock of the throne itself. The cruelty of his gaze lay in its absolute lack of humanity. He watched her trembling in her blue silks, her eyes downcast, and he felt nothing for her plight. He only calculated the value she added to his portfolio. It was the gaze of a merchant inspecting a fine carpet, or a general inspecting a fortification. Is it strong? Will it last? Is it worth the cost? The silence in the hall was stretching thin. The other guests were holding their breath, waiting for someone to break the tension. They were terrified to speak, knowing that the wrong request could turn the king's mood from generous to murderous in a heartbeat. They were sheep waiting for the shepherd. But Artabanus was a wolf. He took a step forward. The sound of his heavy boot on the stone floor was like a gavel striking a desk. The crowd parted instinctively. He was a man who carried an aura of violence even when he was unarmed. He walked with the stiffness of old injuries, a physical reminder of the sacrifices he had made for this ungrateful dynasty. He stopped before the dais. He did not bow as low as the others. He offered the respectful nod of a veteran who believes he has earned the right to look a king in the eye. "Great king," Artabanus said. His voice was gravel and smoke, a stark contrast to the slurred, melodic shouting of Xerxes. "You have offered a boon. You have sworn by the sacred fire." Xerxes leaned forward, his face flushed with wine and affection. "Speak, old friend. The empire listens." Artabanus paused. This was the precipice. If he asked this, there was no going back. It was an insult to the king's dignity to ask for a princess who should be reserved for a foreign prince or a high noble of the 7 great houses. It was a breach of the unspoken social contract. It was predatory. But Artabanus knew his king. He knew that Xerxes was currently trapped in the prison of his own vanity. Xerxes needed to be the generous god. If Artabanus asked for something impossible, Xerxes would have to grant it, or admit that his power had limits. Artabanus was betting everything on the king's weakness. He looked at Amestris one last time. He saw the way she clutched her dress, the white knuckles of her small hands. He saw the life she could have had, a life of relative peace, perhaps married to a young noble she could love, or at least respect. He saw that future, and he decided to crush it. He decided that his safety was worth more than her entire existence. He turned back to the king. "I have served your father, and I have served you," Artabanus said, his voice carrying to the back of the hall. "I have no need for gold, for I have the spoils of war. I have no need for land, for my grave will be the only earth I require soon enough." He let the false humility hang in the air. "But I seek to bind my house to yours, so that my loyalty may be written in blood for generations to come. I ask for the hand of the Princess Amestris." The words hit the room like a physical blow. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the Apadana. Musicians stopped mid-strum. Servants froze with pitchers of wine suspended in mid-air. The shock was visceral. It was grotesque. A man of 60 asking for a girl of 14? A servant asking for the daughter of the king? It was not just a marriage proposal. It was a challenge. Artabanus was staring directly at Xerxes, his expression unreadable. Waiting. He had thrown the gauntlet. He had trapped the king in his own oath. In that frozen second, the fate of the empire shifted. We often look for the causes of historical tragedy in the movements of armies or the fluctuation of grain prices. But sometimes, The root of evil is much simpler. It is one old man, terrified of dying alone and powerless, willing to consume a young girl's life to buy himself a little more time in the sun. Artabanus stood his ground, the shadow of his ambition stretching long and dark across the floor, reaching out to swallow the princess whole. He had asked the impossible. Now the king had to choose between his daughter's life and his own divine pride. The silence that followed Artabanus' request was not merely an absence of noise. It was a physical weight, heavy and suffocating, like a blanket of wet wool thrown over the entire assembly. "I ask for the hand of the princess Amestris." The words hung in the air, refusing to dissipate. They echoed off the polished black stone of the Apadana columns, bouncing back to the ears of the king as if to mock him. In the history of the Persian court, there had been moments of tension, executions, declarations of war, the whispering of assassins, but few moments carried the visceral, stomach-turning shock of this one. To understand why the room froze, why seasoned generals lowered their eyes, and why the eunuchs stopped breathing, we must understand the unspoken laws of the Achaemenid world. There were lines that were never crossed, not even by the most powerful men. One did not look the king's wives in the eye, one did not touch the king's cup, and one certainly did not, under any circumstances, demand the blood of the dynasty for oneself. Marriage in the ancient world was a transaction, yes, but it was a transaction governed by a rigid hierarchy. Princesses of the blood royal were reserved for high diplomacy. They were the glue that held the empire together, married off to the great satraps of distant provinces to ensure loyalty, or to foreign kings to secure peace. They were not prizes to be claimed by a servant, even a servant as high-ranking as Artabanus. And then there was the matter of the age. Even by the standards of antiquity, where age gaps were common, this was grotesque. Artabanus was a man in the winter of his life, his body scarred and stiffened by decades of war, his beard gray, his hands weathered like old leather. Amestris was a spring flower, barely 14, her life unwritten. To place them side by side, the old wolf and the young lamb, was an aesthetic and moral violation that made the skin crawl. The courtiers, who moments ago had been cheering for the king's generosity, now looked on with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. They were witnessing a desecration. Xerxes, seated high on his golden throne, felt the world tilt on its axis. The wine, which moments ago had made him feel like a god, now turned to vinegar in his stomach. The haze of intoxication evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. He stared at Artabanus, searching for a sign that this was a joke, a dark piece of soldier's humor. But Artabanus' face was stone. His eyes were steady, unblinking, locking gaze with the king. It was a trap. Xerxes realized it with a jolt of horror. He had been outmaneuvered. He had been hunted in his own palace. The request was not a humble plea. It was a checkmate. By invoking the sacred oath to Ahura Mazda, by swearing by the salt and the earth, and by the holy fire, Xerxes had removed his own ability to say no. In the Persian ethical cosmos, the universe was a battleground between Asha, truth, order, and Drauga, the lie. The king was the earthly representative of Asha. His word was the binding force of reality. If the king broke a sworn oath, he was not just a liar, he was an agent of Drauga. He became a creature of chaos. To refuse Artabanus now, after swearing before thousands of witnesses and the gods themselves, would be to delegitimize his own right to rule. It would signal to every potential rebel in the empire that the king's word was worthless. Xerxes looked at his hands, clutching the armrests of his throne. They were shaking. He looked at Amestris. The young princess had gone pale. The blood had drained from her face, leaving her looking like a wax doll. She stood frozen, her eyes wide, darting from her father to the old general. She was 14, but she was a child of the court. She understood enough to know that something terrible was happening. She saw the shift in the room. She saw the fear in the eyes of her attendants. She looked at her father, her protector, the man who was supposed to be a god, pleading silently for him to laugh, to dismiss the old man, to say, "Don't be foolish, Artabanus, ask for gold." But the king said nothing. The silence stretched on, becoming agonizing. A fly buzzed near a torch, the sound impossibly loud in the hush. The courtiers watched the king with the cruel detachment of spectators at an execution. They were seeing the King of Kings stripped naked. They saw him not as a deity, but as a man caught in a snare of his own making. If he said no, he saved his daughter but destroyed his authority. If he said yes, he saved his authority but destroyed his daughter. Artabanus waited. He did not fidget. He did not apologize. He stood with the terrifying patience of a man who knows he has won. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was capitalizing on Xerxes' greatest weakness, his insecurity. He knew that Xerxes, fresh from the humiliation of the Greek wars, could not afford another public failure. He could not afford to look weak in front of his satraps. Artabanus was betting that the king loved his own image more than he loved his child. It was a gamble of breathtaking cruelty. Amestris took a half step back, a small, involuntary movement of retreat. The silk of her dress rustled, a whisper of sound that seemed to scream in the quiet hall. That small movement broke the spell for a moment. It reminded everyone that she was real, that she was not a concept or a bargaining chip, but a living, breathing girl who was terrified. Some of the concubines in the shadows turned away, unable to watch. They knew the fate of women in this world. They knew that once a woman was handed over, she ceased to be a person and became property. To be given to Artabanus, a man known for his rigid discipline and cold ambition, was a sentence to a life of joyless servitude. Xerxes opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His throat was dry. He looked at the ceiling, at the great cedar beams brought from Lebanon, perhaps looking for divine intervention. But the gods were silent. The only god in the room was him, and he was powerless. He looked back at Artabanus. In that exchange of glances, a silent conversation took place. "You dare?" the king's eyes screamed. "You dare use my own words against me?" "I dare," Artabanus' eyes replied, "because I know who you are. I know what you value." The tragedy of this moment was not just the impending marriage, it was the public revelation of the corruption at the heart of the empire. A healthy kingdom protects its future, its youth. Here, the past was devouring the future. The old generation, represented by Artabanus, was consuming the young generation to sustain its own power. And the king, the guardian of the realm, was complicit. The guests shifted uncomfortably. They wanted the tension to break. They wanted the king to shout, to order the guards to seize Artabanus for his insolence. They wanted the fairy tale ending where the father saves the princess. But this was not a fairy tale. This was Persepolis in the aftermath of defeat. This was a world of survival. Finally, the king moved. He slumped slightly in his throne, the posture of a man whose strings have been cut. The grandeur, the divine aura, the mask we spoke of earlier, it all slipped away. For a fleeting second, everyone in the hall saw Xerxes for what he was. A frightened man, cornered and alone. He looked at Amestris one last time. In his eyes, there was no longer pride. There was only an apology that he would never speak aloud. He was about to commit the ultimate betrayal. He was about to prove that the King of Kings was a slave to his own vanity. The impossible request had been made. The trap had snapped shut. And now, the executioner waited for the king to give the signal. The throne of the Persian Empire was not designed for comfort. It was a high, rigid structure of gold and cedar, elevated above the floor so that the king's feet would never touch the same dust as common men. It was designed to separate the ruler from the ruled, to turn a man into an idol. But in that agonizing, suspended moment, Xerxes discovered the terrible truth about his golden seat. It was not a pedestal. It was a pillory. He was trapped. The silence in the Apadana stretched into an eternity. It was a silence so profound that the sputtering of the torches sounded like the cracking of whips. Every eye in the room was fixed on Xerxes' face, watching the color drain from his cheeks, watching the way his knuckles turned white as he gripped the armrests of the throne. They were witnessing a geological event in the political landscape of the empire, the cracking of the king's infallibility. Inside Xerxes' mind, a storm was raging. We often imagine that tyrants make decisions with cold, unfeeling speed, but the paralysis that gripped the king was born of a frantic, chaotic collision of two opposing terrors. On one side stood the father. Somewhere beneath the layers of silk and the years of divine propaganda, there was a man who remembered holding Amestris when she was an infant. He remembered her first steps in the harem gardens. He remembered the pride he felt just moments ago watching her dance a creature of light and grace that belonged to him. The thought of handing her to Artabanus, this grim, scarred relic of a violent past, a man whose skin smelled of old leather and ambition, was physically revulsive. It was a violation of nature. Every instinct in his blood screamed to order the guards to seize the general, to strip him of his rank, to throw him into the dungeons for his insolence. But on the other side stood the king, and the king was terrified. The ghost of Greece was in the room. The ashes of the defeated Persian fleet were still floating in the collective memory of the court. Xerxes knew, with the sharp instinct of a survivor, that his authority was brittle. The satraps watching him, the governors of Babylon, of Egypt, of Bactria, were like wolves waiting for the alpha to limp. They were looking for a crack. They were looking for proof that the great king was just a man who made mistakes, a man who could be bullied, a man who broke his word. If he refused Artabanus, he would be breaking a sacred oath sworn by Ahura Mazda. In the eyes of his people, this was not a technicality. It was a theological catastrophe. The king was the defender of Asha, truth. If he became a liar, he lost the Kvarna, the divine glory that sanctioned his rule. A king without glory was an open target for assassination. If he broke his word tonight, what was to stop a general in Cappadocia from breaking his oath of loyalty tomorrow? Xerxes looked at the faces in the crowd. He saw the anticipation. He saw the cruelty. He realized that they didn't care about Amestris. To them, she was just collateral damage. They only cared about the test. Is he strong? They wondered. Is he bound by his word like iron? Or is he soft like clay? If he saved his daughter, he would be called weak. The king who swears and retreats, they would whisper. The king who fears an old general. The laughter would start in the taverns of Persepolis and end with a knife in his back in the dark corridors of the palace. But if he sacrificed her, if he gave her away like a sheep to the butcher, he would be terrible. But he would be king. He would be the man whose word was so absolute, so terrifyingly binding, that not even his own flesh and blood could stand against it. It was a monstrous kind of strength, but in the brutal calculus of the ancient world, it was strength nonetheless. The logic was cold, hard, and undeniable. The empire required a victim. The stability of the throne required a sacrifice. Xerxes looked at Amestris. She was looking back at him, her eyes wide pools of pleading. She was begging him to be her father. She was begging him to remember that she was a person, not a thing. For a second, their eyes locked, and a silent, tragic communication passed between them. "Papa, please," her eyes said. "I cannot," his eyes replied. "I am not your father right now. I am the state." He looked away. He broke the connection. In that small movement, the turning of a head, the betrayal was consummated. He chose the myth over the girl. He chose the mask over the face. He drew a breath. It rattled in his chest. The air felt too thick, too hot. He needed to speak before his courage failed him. He needed to say the word that would end his daughter's life as she knew it, and seal his own soul in a tomb of guilt. He straightened his back. He forced his hands to relax their grip on the throne. He composed his face into the mask of impassive, divine authority that he had worn for so long. He had to make it look like a choice, not a surrender. He had to make it look like generosity, not defeat. "Artabanus," the king said. His voice was lower now, stripped of the drunken booming from earlier. It was the voice of a man who has just killed a part of himself. "You ask for a prize that is beyond the reach of common men. You ask for the blood of the Achaemenids to mingle with your own?" He paused. The room leaned in. Artabanus did not flinch. "You have served my father, Darius, and you have served me. Your loyalty has been the shield of this throne." Xerxes was building a narrative, constructing a justification for the historians. He was pretending that this was a reward for service, rather than a capitulation to a trap. "Therefore," Xerxes continued, the word hanging heavy in the air, "let it be known that the King of Kings does not speak in vain. The word of the king is the law of the earth. What has been sworn by the fire cannot be unmade." Amestris let out a small, sharp sound, a gasp that was half sob, but it was swallowed by the vastness of the hall. "The request is granted," Xerxes said. The word fell like a stone into a deep well. Granted. It was done. The tension in the room snapped. A collective exhale rushed through the hall, a sound like a sudden wind. The courtiers, sensing that the danger had passed, that the king remained the king, however ruthless, erupted into applause. It was a grotesque, jarring sound, clapping for a human sacrifice. They cheered the king's integrity. They cheered his generosity. They cheered because they were relieved that the unpredictable drama was over and they could go back to their wine. Artabanus bowed. It was a deep, formal bow. But those closest to him could see the faint curl of satisfaction at the corner of his mouth. He had won. He had stared down the most powerful man in the world and walked away with the prize. He had secured his future. "I am humbled by your greatness, my king," Artabanus said, his voice smooth as oil. "The gods shine upon your justice." Justice. The word tasted like ash in Xerxes' mouth. He watched as Artabanus turned and walked toward Amestris. The old general moved with a proprietary air now. He was no longer looking at a princess, he was looking at his wife. He reached out a hand that had held spears, strangled enemies, and signed death warrants and waited for her to take it. Amestris stood frozen. She looked at the hand, then up at the general's face, and finally back at her father. But the king was no longer looking at her. He had picked up his cup. He was staring into the dark wine, refusing to witness the consequence of his justice. He was drinking to forget again, even before the deed was fully done. Slowly, with the mechanical, jerky movements of a marionette whose strings are tangled, Amestris lifted her hand. She placed her small, trembling fingers into the rough, calloused palm of Artabanus. The contact was the final seal. The cold grip of the general closed around her wrist. It was not a hold of affection, it was a shackle. The musicians, taking their cue from the renewed applause, struck up a lively tune. The drums beat a rhythm of celebration. The dancers returned to the floor, spinning and laughing, their bells jingling. The party resumed. The machine of the empire groaned and continued to turn, indifferent to the small tragedy that had just occurred at its center. But for Xerxes, the music was a torment. He sat on his throne, surrounded by the adulation of his subjects, the most powerful man on earth. And yet, he had never been more pathetic. He had preserved his crown, but he had cracked the throne. He had shown that the king could be maneuvered, that the king could be trapped, and that the king would sell his own blood to save face. The banquet continued into the night, louder and wilder than before. But high above the revelry, the stone bulls on the column seemed to stare down in silent judgment. The crack had appeared, and through that crack, the slow, insidious poison of resentment and vengeance would begin to seep, eventually rotting the dynasty from the inside out. Amestris was led away, not to her death, but to something that felt frighteningly similar. And as she walked out of the light of the Apadana and into the shadows of Artabanus' ambition, the girl died, and the victim was born. 3 months is a long time to wait for the executioner. In the fevered heat of the banquet, the decision had been a sudden, violent strike, a thunderclap that shattered the world in an instant. But the aftermath was a slow, grinding erosion. For 90 days, the sun rose and set over the Zagros Mountains, casting long shadows across the terraces of Persepolis. For 90 days, the scribes cataloged the dowry, the priests consulted the stars for auspicious omens, and the artisans hammered gold into shapes worthy of a princess. To the outside world, to the merchants in the lower city and the farmers in the plains of Marvdasht, this was a time of excitement. A royal wedding was a promise of stability. It meant festivals, it meant free grain distributed in the squares, it meant the gods were smiling on the dynasty. The city was dressing itself in joy. Banners of Tyrian purple, the color of kings, snapped in the wind from the high walls. The streets were swept clean of dust and dung, then sprinkled with rosewater until the very stones seemed to bloom. But inside the palace, the atmosphere was not one of celebration. It was one of suffocating, ritualized mourning. Those who lived within the high walls, the eunuchs, the concubines, the servants, knew the truth. They moved through the corridors with hushed voices and averted eyes, like mourners in a house of the dead. They knew that the ceremony being prepared was not a union of souls, but a transfer of property. They were witnessing a funeral in silk. On the morning of the wedding, Amestris was woken before dawn. The sky was a bruised purple, the stars still clinging to the edge of the night. She had not slept, of course. How does one sleep when the hours are counting down to the end of one's life? She was led into the preparation chamber, a room of polished marble and silver mirrors, lit by the soft, wavering glow of oil lamps. The air was thick with the scent of myrrh and sandalwood scents that were used to anoint the statues of gods and the bodies of the dead. The parallel was not lost on her. Today, she was both. Her attendants, women who had known her since she was a child, worked in a terrible, heavy silence. There was no giggling, no bawdy jokes about the wedding night, no whispered advice about how to please a husband. Those were the sounds of a normal wedding. Here, the silence was an admission of guilt. They washed her body with sponges soaked in milk and almond oil, scrubbing her skin until it glowed in the dim light. It felt less like a beauty ritual and more like the preparation of a sacrificial lamb, cleansing the victim so it would be worthy of the knife. Then began the dressing. In the Achaemenid court, clothing was not merely protection against the elements, it was a language. It spoke of rank, of power, and of weight. For a princess marrying a man of Artabanus' ambition, the dress had to be overwhelming. First came the undertunics of linen, white as bone, imported from the Nile Delta. Then, the outer robes of heavy silk, dyed in deep crimson and gold. The fabric was stiff, embroidered with intricate patterns of lions and lotuses, symbols of the empire's strength and fertility. As the layers were draped over her small frame, Amestris felt herself disappearing. The girl was being buried under the symbol. The silk weighed down on her shoulders, pressing her into the floor, restricting her movement. It was a beautiful, shimmering cage. Then came the jewelry. This was the true burden. The attendants opened caskets of cedar wood, revealing the wealth of the dynasty. They fastened heavy golden torque rings around her neck, cold metal against warm skin. They slid wide bracelets of beaten gold up her forearms, etched with the winged disc of Ahura Mazda. They pinned brooches of lapis lazuli and turquoise into her hair, stones that carried the weight of mountains. Each piece was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, worth more than a village of commoners would earn in a lifetime. But to Amestris, they were not ornaments. They were price tags. The gold around her neck was the bride price. The gems in her hair were the political capital her father was spending to buy his general's loyalty. She was being turned into a living treasury. She looked into the silver mirror and did not recognize the reflection staring back. The girl with the frightened eyes was gone, hidden behind a facade of glittering metal and stiff fabric. In her place stood an idol, a golden doll, constructed to satisfy the vanity of two men. The physical weight of the ensemble was staggering. She could barely lift her arms. She had to stand perfectly straight just to support the mass of the regalia. And perhaps that was the point. A Persian princess was not meant to move freely. She was meant to be static, eternal, a fixture of the court. "You look magnificent, Highness," one of the older attendants whispered. The woman's voice cracked, and she quickly looked away, pretending to adjust the hem of the robe to hide the tears welling in her eyes. Amestris did not answer. She had stopped speaking days ago. She had retreated into a deep, internal fortress, a place in her mind where the walls were high and the windows were bricked up. It was a survival mechanism. If she stayed present, if she allowed herself to feel the reality of what was happening, that in a few hours she would be locked in the bedchamber of a man 3 times her age, a man who looked at her with cold calculation, she would shatter. She would scream, she would tear the silk, she would claw at the heavy doors. And so, she dissociated. She became a spectator in her own body. She watched the hands of the servants moving over her, adjusting, pinning, smoothing. She felt the cold of the gold and the scratch of the embroidery. But she felt it from a great distance, as if it were happening to someone else. Outside the window, the sun had fully risen. The sound of drums began to drift up from the lower courtyards. The guests were arriving. The great families of Persia were gathering again, wearing their finest robes, ready to feast and drink. They would marvel at the bride. They would praise her beauty. They would congratulate Artabanus on his good fortune. They would toast the king for his benevolence. They would participate in the great lie, nodding and smiling while a 14-year-old girl was walked to the altar like a prisoner to the gallows. A eunuch appeared at the door, striking his staff against the stone floor 3 times. The signal. It was time. Amestris took a breath. The heavy bands of gold around her chest made it difficult to expand her lungs. She felt lightheaded, but she locked her knees, forcing strength into her legs. She had been trained for this. Since she was a toddler, she had been taught the protocol of the court. Chin up, eyes forward, face impassive. Do not show weakness. Do not show fear. You are the daughter of Xerxes. The irony was bitter. It was her status as the daughter of Xerxes that had doomed her. And now it was her training as the daughter of Xerxes that allowed her to walk toward her doom with dignity. She stepped out of the chamber. The silk rustled loudly, a sound like dry leaves blowing over a grave. Flanked by her guards and attendants, she began the long walk through the palace corridors toward the Apadana. The hallway seemed to stretch into infinity. Every torch sconce, every stone relief on the wall, every shadow seemed to be watching her. She passed the entrance to the harem gardens, catching a glimpse of the pomegranate trees where she used to play. That world was gone now, severed from her as if by a blade. She was crossing a threshold from which there was no return. As she neared the great hall, the noise of the crowd grew louder, a roar of voices, music, and laughter. It sounded like the ocean, vast and indifferent. It sounded like a beast waiting to be fed. Amestris paused for a fraction of a second, her foot hovering over the marble threshold. Her heart hammered against her ribs. a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone and gold. She wanted to run. She wanted to turn back to the safety of the women's quarters, to hide under her bed, to be a child again. But the heavy hand of duty, of history, and of the empire pushed her forward. There was no running. There was only the script that had been written for her by men who thought they were gods. She stepped forward into the blinding light of the hall. The music swelled. The crowd turned. The funeral procession had arrived at the altar, but the mourners were cheering, and the corpse was still walking. The distance between the great bronze doors of the Apadana and the high altar was perhaps 200 paces. For a marching soldier, it was a matter of seconds. For a courier running with news of war, it was a blur. But for a mistress, weighed down by the gold of the empire and the leaden dread in her heart, it was a journey across an infinite desert. The hall was a canyon of noise. The moment she crossed the threshold, the air itself seemed to vibrate with the sound of flutes, drums, and the sistrum, a rattling percussion instrument meant to ward off evil spirits. The irony was suffocating. The evil was not a spirit lurking in the shadows. The evil was standing at the end of the aisle, waiting for her with a smile that did not reach his eyes. The guests had parted to form a wide avenue. As Amestris walked, she felt the heat of their bodies and the weight of their gazes. To them, she was a spectacle, a shimmering, golden object moving through the gloom. They craned their necks to see the bride, whispering to one another about the richness of her dowry, the intricacy of her embroidery, the political genius of the match. "Look at the pearls," a noblewoman whispered behind her fan. "They say they are from the warm seas of the south." "Look at the general," a satrap murmured to his neighbor. "He looks like a cat who has finally cornered the bird." They saw the wealth, they saw the power, they refused to see the girl. It was a collective act of blindness, a social contract signed by every person in the room. We will pretend this is a celebration, so that we do not have to admit it is a sale. Amestris kept her eyes fixed on the floor, watching the tips of her embroidered slippers appear and disappear beneath the heavy hem of her robe. One step, another step, just keep walking. If she looked up, if she saw the faces of the men who had drunk wine with her father while plotting her fate, she might collapse. So she narrowed her world down to the stone beneath her feet. But she could not ignore the figure waiting at the end of the path. Artabanus did not look like a groom. He looked like a conqueror, receiving the keys to a surrendered city. He was dressed in a robe of deep indigo, belted with a sash of silver thread. He stood with his feet apart, a military stance, grounded and immovable. His gray beard was oiled and combed, and his face, etched with the deep lines of 60 years of sun and violence, was a mask of grim satisfaction. There was no softness in him, no nervous anticipation of a man waiting for his beloved. He radiated a terrifying calm. He watched Amestris approach not with the adoration of a lover, but with the critical eye of an appraiser. He was checking the merchandise. Was she healthy? Was she docile? Would she bear the weight of his ambition? As Amestris reached the foot of the dais, the music reached a crescendo, and then, with a sharp signal from the bandmaster, cut into abrupt silence. The sudden quiet was more deafening than the drums. It stripped away the festive facade, leaving the three principal actors exposed on the stage of history: the king, the general, and the victim. Xerxes stood by the sacred fire altar. The flames danced in the silver brazier, fed by sandalwood and frankincense. In the Zoroastrian tradition, fire was the visible presence of Ahura Mazda, the embodiment of truth and purity. Marriages were sworn before the fire so that the light of God would illuminate the union. The blasphemy of it made the air feel thick. Here they were, invoking the God of truth to sanctify a union built entirely on a lie. The lie that this was a willing match. The lie that the king was generous. The lie that Artabanus was worthy. The priest, a magus dressed in white robes, began the incantations. The ancient Avestan words rolled over the assembly, rhythmic and hypnotic. They spoke of the union of earth and sky, of water and plant, of man and woman. They spoke of creation and the duty to bring forth life. Duty. That was the word that hammered in Amestris' mind. Duty. It was the chain that bound her wrists. Then came the moment of the handover. In a traditional ceremony, the father places the hand of the daughter into the hand of the husband, symbolizing the transfer of protection. It is usually a moment of bittersweet emotion, a father letting go of his child. Xerxes stepped down from his high seat. He looked diminished. The King of Kings seemed to shrink in the presence of his own guilt. He could not meet his daughter's eyes. He looked at her forehead, at her shoulder, at the fire anywhere but into the gaze of the child he was betraying. He reached out and took Amestra's hand. Her fingers were ice cold, trembling violently within his grasp. He felt that tremor. It traveled up his arm like an electric shock, a physical transmission of her terror. For a split second, his grip faltered. The father inside him screamed, "Stop! This is madness. She is your blood." But then he looked up and saw Artabanus. The old general was waiting, hand extended, his eyes hard and expectant. He was daring the king to pull back. He was daring the king to show weakness. Xerxes hardened his heart. He clamped his jaw, suppressing the human instinct, and suffocated the father to save the monarch. With a stiff, mechanical motion, he lifted Amestra's hand and placed it into the waiting palm of Artabanus. The trap snapped shut. Artabanus' fingers closed around hers. His hand was rough, calloused from the hilt of a sword and the reins of a horse. It was a hand that knew how to crush, not how to hold. He did not squeeze gently. He gripped her with a possessive firmness, anchoring her to him. At that contact, a ripple went through the court. It was done. The pact was sealed. The king had paid his debt with the body of his daughter. "I take this woman," Artabanus said, his voice gravelly and loud, projecting to the back of the hall, under the eyes of Ahura Mazda, "to be the keeper of my house and the mother of my line." The mother of my line. There it was, the naked truth of his intent. He did not want a companion. He wanted a broodmare. He wanted a biological vessel to mix his common blood with the divine ichor of the Achaemenids. Amestris was required to speak. The ritual demanded consent, even if feigned. The priest looked at her, waiting. The silence stretched, balancing on a knife's edge. If she screamed, if she refused, she would not save herself. She would only bring shame and perhaps death. She knew the script. I accept," she whispered. The words were so faint they were barely audible, a ghost of a voice. But in the acoustic perfection of the hall, they were enough. "I accept the protection of Artabanus." It was the final surrender. With those words, the Princess Amestris ceased to exist as an independent entity. She became the wife of Artabanus. The magus threw a handful of seeds into the fire. The flames roared up, crackling and spitting sparks, consuming the offering. The crowd erupted into applause again, louder this time. Relieved that the ritual was over without incident, the tension broke. The wine-bearers rushed forward to refill cups. The musicians struck up a frantic, joyous rhythm, but on the dais, the atmosphere remained frozen. Artabanus did not let go of her hand. He pulled her slightly closer, a subtle assertion of dominance. He leaned down, his breath smelling of spices and old wine, and whispered something that the chronicles do not record, but which we can imagine. Perhaps it was a threat, perhaps it was a command, or perhaps it was simply, "You are mine now." He turned to the court, raising her hand high in the air, displaying their joined grasp like a trophy won in battle. His face radiated a victorious arrogance that bordered on insolence. He was looking at the young nobles, the handsome princes who should have been standing in his place, and his eyes said, "I have taken what you could not. I have eaten the king's heart." The guests cheered, but the sound was hollow. Even the most cynical courtier felt the wrongness of the image, the gray, scarred wolf clutching the trembling, golden bird. It was an image of consumption, not union. Xerxes turned his back. He climbed the steps to his throne quickly, almost stumbling in his haste to put distance between himself and the couple. He sat down and signaled for more wine. He needed to blur the edges of the world again. He needed to forget the feeling of those cold, trembling fingers slipping from his grasp. The ceremony was over. The celebration would continue for hours, descending into drunken revelry. But for Amestris, the party was already a distant memory. She stood beside her husband, a statue of gold and silk, while the realization settled over her like a shroud. The palace, which had been her home, was now a foreign land. Her father was no longer her protector, and the night was coming, the first night of a lifetime of nights in the house of a stranger. The unholy union was complete. The mask of Persepolis remained in place, smiling its golden smile, while behind it, a life was quietly, methodically extinguished. The doors of the royal palace did not just close behind Amestris, they sealed. There is a specific sound that a heavy door makes when it locks out the world, a dull, final thud that resonates in the bones. For Amestris, leaving the great palace of Persepolis was not merely a change of address, it was an exile. She was being banished from the only universe she had ever known. traveling just a few miles down the royal road, yet arriving in a completely different reality. Have you ever wondered what happens to the princess after the wedding in a story where there is no happily ever after? We assume the tragedy is the wedding itself, but the true horror is often the silence that follows. What happens when the music stops, the guests go home, and the victim is left alone with the monster? The carriage ride to the estate of Artabanus was short, but it felt like a descent into the underworld. The noise of the city, still drunk on the king's wine, faded into a distant hum. The carriage turned off the main thoroughfare, passing through gates of iron and cedar, entering a compound that sat like a fortress in the shadow of the mountains. The house of Artabanus was not built for beauty, it was built for security. While the royal palace was an explosion of color, gardens, and flowing water, this estate was a reflection of its master, rigid, austere, and imposing. The walls were high, topped with crenellations like a border fort. The gardens were manicured with a military precision that strangled nature rather than celebrating it. There were no wild, overgrown jasmine bushes here, only rows of cypress trees standing like sentinels in the gloom. When Amestris stepped out of the carriage, the first thing she noticed was the silence. It was not the peaceful silence of a library or a temple. It was the heavy, watchful silence of a prison. The servants here did not bustle with the chaotic energy of the palace staff. They moved with their heads down, eyes fixed on the ground, terrified of making a sound. They knew their master. They knew that in the house of Artabanus, noise was interpreted as disorder, and disorder was punished. Artabanus was waiting for her in the main courtyard. He had ridden ahead, eager to establish his dominion before she even crossed the threshold. He stood on the steps of his private quarters, the Baruni, looking down at her. He had shed his wedding robes and was dressed in a simple tunic, the uniform of a man ready to work. For him, this marriage was work. It was the maintenance of power. "Welcome," he said. The word was cold, stripped of any warmth. "This is your home now. Forget the palace. That life is over." He didn't offer her a tour. He didn't ask if she was comfortable. He simply turned and walked inside, expecting her to follow. And she did. She followed because she had nowhere else to go. The transition from the royal harem to this private isolation was a shock that is difficult for a modern mind to fully grasp. We tend to think of the ancient harem as a place of oppression, and it was. But it was also a community. The Andaruni, the woman's quarters, of the king, was a bustling city within a city. Amestris had grown up surrounded by hundreds of women. Her mother, her aunts, her sisters, the concubines, the wet nurses, the storytellers. There was laughter, there was gossip, there was a complex social web that provided emotional support. In the harem, a woman was never truly alone. But here, she was an island. Artabanus led her to her quarters, a suite of rooms at the back of the house. They were luxurious, yes. The floors were covered in thick woolen carpets from Sardis, and the furniture was inlaid with ivory. But the luxury was cold. It was the kind of furniture you are afraid to touch. "You will stay here," Artabanus announced, standing in the doorway, blocking the light. "You have your own servants. They answer to me. You have your own kitchen. The food will be tested before it reaches you." He paused, letting the implication sink in. He wasn't protecting her from random poisoners. He was protecting his investment. And, he added, his voice dropping an octave, "You will receive no visitors without my express permission. No messages will leave this house without my seal. Your father is the king. But here, inside these walls, I am the law." The cruelty of this rule cannot be overstated. In Persian culture, family ties were the very fabric of existence. To cut a woman off from her mother and sisters was a form of psychological amputation. Artabanus knew exactly what he was doing. He was isolating her to break her. He needed to ensure that her loyalty shifted from Xerxes to him, or at the very least, that she could not be used as a conduit for the king to spy on him. He was paranoid. He knew that he had forced the king's hand, and he knew that kings have long memories. He saw Amestris not as a wife, but as a potential double agent, a Trojan horse sent into his home. So, he treated her like a prisoner of war. The door closed. The latch clicked. Amestris stood in the center of the room, still wearing her heavy wedding jewelry. The gold felt like it was burning her skin. She looked around at the silent walls, the shuttered windows that allowed only thin slivers of light to enter. The silence pressed in on her ears, a physical pressure. She sat on the edge of the bed. She didn't cry. Not yet. She was in a state of shock, a numbness that protected her mind from snapping. She began to take off the jewelry, piece by piece. The heavy necklace clattered onto the table, the bracelets, the rings. With every piece she removed, she felt lighter, yet more vulnerable. Without the gold, she was just a girl in a strange room. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The silent cage began to do its work. Her life became a loop of crushing monotony. She would wake up, be dressed by servants who were too afraid to speak to her, eat meals alone, and sit by the window watching the shadows lengthen across the courtyard. She was not allowed to walk in the gardens unattended. She was not allowed to go to the market. She was not allowed to pray in the local temple. Her identity began to erode. In the palace, she was Princess Amestris, a vibrant, talented girl who danced and played the harp. Here, she was simply the wife. Her name was rarely spoken. Her talents were irrelevant. Artabanus had no interest in her mind or her art. He never asked her to play music. He never asked her opinion. To him, she was a biological necessity, a waiting room for his heir. The isolation was compounded by surveillance. Artabanus had placed his most loyal eunuchs in her quarters. They stood in the corners of the room, silent and watchful, like statues with eyes. Every movement she made was noted. If she sighed, if she paced the floor, if she refused to eat, it was all reported back to the general. Imagine the psychological terror of never being truly alone, yet having no one to talk to. It is a specific kind of torture that leaves no marks on the body but hollows out the soul. Amestris began to change. The light in her eyes, which had captivated the court during her dance, began to dim. She moved slower. She spoke less. When she did speak, her voice was a whisper, as if she had forgotten how to use it. She was fading. She tried once to send a letter. She bribed a young servant girl with a gold ring to carry a note to her mother, Queen Amestris, her namesake, begging for a visit. But the servant was terrified of Artabanus. The note was intercepted before it even left the courtyard. That night, Artabanus came to her room. He didn't shout. He didn't hit her. He simply held the crumpled piece of papyrus in his hand and looked at her with a disappointment that was more terrifying than rage. "I told you," he said softly, that life is over. Why do you struggle against the inevitable? You are planted here now. You will grow here, or you will wither here, but you will not leave. He burned the letter in the flame of an oil lamp, watching the paper curl into black ash. "Do not make me increase the guard, Amestris, for your own sake." He left, leaving the smell of burnt paper in the air. That was the moment hope broke. She realized that her father wasn't coming. Her mother wasn't coming. The walls were too high, and the world had moved on. The King of Kings was busy ruling the earth. He had no time to rescue the daughter he had sold to keep his throne. She went to the window and looked out at the moon hanging over the Zagros mountains. It was the same moon that shone on the palace, but it looked different here. Colder, distant, indifferent. She was 14 years old, and her life was effectively over. She was trapped in a golden box, waiting to fulfill a biological function for a man she despised. The silent cage had no bars, but it was inescapable, and as the months dragged on, a new, darker realization began to take root in her mind. If she was to survive this, she could not remain the soft, gentle girl who danced in the palace. That girl would die in this house. If she wanted to live, she would have to become something else, something harder, something cold enough to withstand the frost of Artabanus' heart. But before she could harden herself, she would be broken, completely. For Artabanus had one singular obsession, one demand that hovered over the house like a storm cloud, and it was about to descend upon her with terrifying force. In the cold mathematics of Artabanus' mind, Amestris was not a wife. She was a vessel. She was an expensive, beautifully decorated container acquired for the sole purpose of carrying a specific cargo. To understand the nightmare that descended upon the young princess in the months following her marriage, we must look at the calendar through the eyes of the general. Artabanus was over 60. In the ancient world, this was borrowed time. Every morning he woke up, he felt the stiffness in his joints, and the rattle in his chest reminders that the grave was waiting. He had accumulated power, wealth, and land, but he knew better than anyone that without a blood link to the throne, his legacy would evaporate the moment he stopped breathing. His current sons were capable soldiers, yes, but they were commoners in the eyes of the high nobility. They could be dismissed, exiled, or executed by a whim of the king. But a son born of Amestris, that child would be a grandson of Xerxes. That child would carry the Kvarina, the divine glory of kings. That child would be untouchable. And so, the house of Artabanus was reorganized around a single, frantic objective: conception. The privacy of the marriage bed is usually a sanctuary, or at least a secret. But for Amestris, her intimacy became a public project. There was no romance, no seduction, not even the pretense of affection. Her body became a territory to be managed, mapped, and conquered. The intrusion began with the physicians. Artabanus spared no expense. He summoned the most renowned healers from the corners of the empire. There were Egyptians with shaved heads who smelled of natron and papyrus, carrying scrolls of medical knowledge dating back to the pharaohs. There were Babylonian herbalists who consulted clay tablets detailing the properties of roots and seeds. There were Greek doctors who spoke of humors and heat. They descended upon Amestris' quarters like a flock of crows. "The womb is cold," an Egyptian physician declared after examining her, speaking about her as if she were a piece of faulty pottery while she sat right there, humiliated and exposed. "It must be warmed with fire and spice." "No," a Babylonian argued. "It is a matter of alignment. The moon must be in the house of the bull." Amestris was subjected to a regime of invasive treatments that stripped away her last shreds of dignity. She was forced to drink bitter, black concoctions made of mandrake root, crushed beetles, and wine tonics so foul they made her gag. When she refused, Artabanus would stand over her, his hand resting on the back of her chair, his voice low and threatening. "Drink," he would say. "You have one duty in this house. Do not fail it." She drank. She swallowed the bitterness, feeling it burn her throat, hating her own body for being the battlefield of this war. But the tonics were only the beginning. There were the fumigations, where she was made to crouch over bowls of burning herbs, myrrh, frankincense, and strange, acrid weeds from the steppes, until her eyes watered and her lungs burned. There were the diets: no cold water, no fish, only red meat and pomegranates, foods thought to stoke the fires of fertility. Her body, once her own, became a stranger to her. She was poked, prodded, measured, and discussed by strange men who looked at her with clinical detachment. She ceased to be a princess. She ceased to be a girl. She became a biological problem to be solved. And then, there was the religion. In the Persian mindset, biology and theology were inseparable. If a woman did not conceive, it was not just a medical failure, it was a spiritual blockage. The gods were withholding their blessing. Artabanus, a man who had spent his life trusting in steel and strategy, suddenly became pious. He ordered the construction of a private shrine to Anahita, the goddess of fertility, water, and wisdom. The statue was carved from white marble, a beautiful, serene woman holding a pomegranate blossom. Every morning, before the sun rose, Amestris was woken and led to this shrine. She was forced to kneel on the cold stone floor, shivering in her thin prayer robes, and recite prayers she did not mean. "Great Anahita," she was made to chant, her voice hollow and trembling. "Purify my waters. Open the gates of life. Grant this house a son of the blood." Imagine the psychological violence of this ritual. She was praying for the very thing that would seal her doom. A child would anchor her to Artabanus forever. A child would make her a permanent fixture in this prison. Yet, she had to beg the goddess for it, day after day, under the watchful eyes of the eunuchs, who reported her piety or lack thereof to her husband. She began to hate the goddess. She began to look at the marble face of Anahita and see not a benevolent mother, but a cruel jailer. She prayed in silence, in the secret chambers of her heart, for the opposite. "Let me be barren," she whispered to herself. "Let my womb be a desert. Let his seed die in the dust." It was her only rebellion. Her body was captive, but her biology could still say no, or so she hoped. But the pressure from Artabanus was relentless. As the months passed without a pregnancy, his patience frayed. The silent cage became a pressure cooker. He began to blame her. In his mind, he was doing everything right. He was paying the doctors. He was making the sacrifices. He was performing his duties as a husband with grim regularity. If there was no child, it must be her fault. It must be her will that was blocking the process. "You resist me," he hissed one night, pacing the floor of her chamber like a caged animal. "I see it in your eyes. You curse me in your heart, and the gods hear you." He grabbed her face, his fingers digging into her cheeks, forcing her to look at him. "Stop fighting me, girl. You cannot win against time. You will give me a son, or you will find that my patience has limits that even your father's protection cannot cross." The threat was vague, but terrifying. Would he cast her aside? No, he couldn't. She was royal. But he could make her life a living hell. He could lock her in the dark. He could hurt her physically. The stress began to manifest in her body. She grew thin, her skin became pale and translucent. She stopped menstruating not because of pregnancy, but because of malnutrition and sheer terror. The doctors, fools that they were, initially celebrated this as a sign of conception, only to be disappointed a month later. Their disappointment turned into Artabanus' rage. Amestris felt herself fracturing. The boundary between herself and the object they wanted her to be was dissolving. She would lie in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, feeling the emptiness of her womb like a physical ache. She was caught in a paradox. She was terrified of having a child, and terrified of not having one. If she had a child, she lost her freedom. If she didn't have a child, she might lose her life. It was a state of constant, high-wire anxiety. She was walking on a tightrope over a pit of vipers, and the wind was blowing harder every day. And then, nature, indifferent to human suffering, took its course. It happened in the deep winter, when the snow covered the Zagros peaks, and the wind howled through the cypress trees of the estate. The sickness came first, a nausea that hit her the moment she smelled the morning oil lamps. Then, the fatigue, a heaviness that dragged her bones down into the mattress. She tried to hide it. She tried to pretend she was just ill, that it was the cold, that it was anything but that. She didn't want to give Artabanus the satisfaction. She didn't want to admit that her body had betrayed her silent rebellion. But the eyes of the harem servants are sharp. The old women who cleaned her linens, the ones who had birthed 10 children themselves, they knew. They saw the signs before she even admitted them to herself. One morning, an older servant woman, a mute who usually moved like a shadow, brought Amestris a bowl of sour pomegranates instead of her usual bread. She placed it on the table and looked at the princess with a gaze that was a mixture of pity and knowing. She touched her own belly, then pointed to Amestris. The secret was out. When the physician confirmed it a week later, Artabanus did not smile. He did not hug her. He did not weep with joy. He simply let out a long, shuddering breath, the sound of a man who has finally secured his perimeter. "Good," he said, looking at her stomach with a terrifying intensity. Now, the real work begins. He didn't look at her face. He was looking at the air. Amestris sat frozen, her hand resting instinctively over her abdomen. She felt a sudden, crushing wave of loneliness. She was no longer just a prisoner. She was a host. There was something growing inside her, something that belonged to him, something that would bind them together in blood and history. The obsession had borne fruit, but fruit born of such a poisoned tree is rarely sweet. The pregnancy was not a time of blooming, it was a siege. In the fairy tales told by the storytellers in the Great Hall, a royal pregnancy is a time of magic. The mother glows, the father dotes, and the kingdom holds its breath in joyful anticipation. But in the house of Artabanus, the 9 months of gestation were a period of suffocating surveillance. The silent cage contracted until it was no larger than the perimeter of a Amestris bed. Artabanus, fueled by the validation of his obsession, became a tyrant of protection. He did not care for Amestris the person. He cared for Amestris the container. A container carrying the most valuable asset in the empire must be guarded against all threats, real or imagined. "She does not walk on the stone floors," he ordered the servants. "It is too cold. Cover everything in wool. She does not eat anything that has not been tasted by 2 slaves," he commanded the kitchen. "If she sickens, you die." Amestris was confined to her rooms. The windows were sealed to prevent bad air from entering. The heavy curtains were drawn to keep out the evil eye. She existed in a twilight world of stale air and hushed whispers. She was forbidden to spin wool. It might tire her. Forbidden to play the harp. It might excite the humors. Forbidden even to cry sadness spoils the milk, the doctor said. She felt herself disappearing. She was no longer a woman. She was a pod. As her belly swelled, her spirit shrank. The depression that had taken root in the early months of her marriage now bloomed into a dark, choking vine. She would spend days lying on her side, staring at the intricate patterns of the rug, tracing the geometric shapes with her eyes until they blurred into chaos. She felt no connection to the life growing inside her. How could she? It was his child. It was the physical manifestation of her defeat. It was a parasite feeding on her youth to fuel an old man's ambition. Sometimes in the dead of night, she would feel the baby kick a sudden, sharp flutter against her ribs. Instead of joy, She felt panic. It was a reminder that there was another person in the room, another jailer, this one living under her own skin. "Get it out!" a voice in her head would scream. "Get it out before it consumes me!" Then, guilt would wash over her, cold and sickening. "It is innocent," another voice would whisper. "It is just a baby." This internal war tore her apart. She was trapped between resentment and instinct, between hatred for the father and a terrifying biological obligation to the child. The seasons changed outside the sealed windows. Winter melted into spring, and the heat of summer began to bake the mud brick walls of the estate. The air in her room grew stifling. Her ankles swelled until she could barely walk. Her back ached with a constant, grinding throb. She was 17 years old, but she felt ancient. Finally, the day came. It started with a cramp, sharp and sudden, like a hook catching inside her lower back. It was early evening. The sun was setting, casting long, bloody streaks across the sky. Amestris let out a gasp, dropping the cup of water she was holding. It shattered on the floor, the first loud noise in that room for months. The servants rushed in. The panic was immediate. Not panic for her pain, but panic for the asset. "Fetch the general!" one shouted. "Fetch the midwives!" cried another. Artabanus arrived before the doctors. He stood in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide. He looked terrified. For the first time, Amestris saw him not as a monster, but as a desperate old man. He knew that everything he had worked for, the marriage, the insults to the king, the political maneuvering hung on what happened in the next few hours. "Save the child," he told the head midwife, a stern woman with hands like iron. "Do whatever you must, but save the child." He did not say, "Save my wife." The labor was brutal. Amestris was small, her frame narrow, her body weakened by months of confinement and melancholy. The baby was large. For 2 days and 2 nights, the house of Artabanus echoed with the sounds of her agony. It was a primitive, violent struggle. The midwives worked with focused intensity, using oil, hot cloths, and chanting prayers to Anahita. Amestris floated in and out of consciousness. The pain was a sea that kept pulling her under. At times, she wished to drown. She wished to simply let go, to slip away into the dark where Artabanus and his ambition could not reach her. But the body fights to live, even when the spirit is willing to yield. On the dawn of the 3rd day, just as the first light touched the peaks of the Zagros, a cry broke the silence. It was a thin, reedy sound, weak and sputtering, but it was unmistakably life. "It is a son," the midwife announced, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. "A son." The news traveled through the house like a shockwave. Servants wept with relief, knowing they wouldn't be punished. Artabanus, who had been pacing the corridor for 40 hours, collapsed onto a bench, burying his face in his hands. He had won. He had an heir. He had a grandson of Xerxes. But in the birthing chamber, the mood was not triumphant. The baby was blue. He was small, frail, and struggling to breathe. His chest rattled with every inhalation. The midwives exchanged worried glances. They cleaned him quickly, wrapping him in warm wool, and placed him in Amestris' arms. She looked down at the child. He did not look like a prince. He looked like a wounded bird. His skin was translucent, his eyes squeezed shut, his tiny fists grasping at the air. He was Artabanus' son, yes, but he was also hers. And in that moment, seeing his fragility, seeing him struggle for every breath just as she had struggled for every day of her freedom, something broke inside her. The hatred evaporated, replaced by a fierce, terrifying pity. "You poor thing," she thought. "You are just like me. You are just a pawn." She touched his cheek with a trembling finger. He was cold. Artabanus burst into the room. He ignored the blood, the smell of sweat, the exhausted state of his wife. He went straight to the bundle in her arms. "Let me see him," he demanded. He pulled the blanket back. He saw the blue tinge of the skin. He heard the wheezing breath. His smile faltered. "Why is he like this?" he snapped at the midwife. "The labor was long, my lord," she said carefully. "He is weak. He needs rest. He needs time." "He is an Achaemenid," Artabanus shouted, his voice cracking. "He is a lion. He is not weak." He refused to accept it. He refused to believe that his grand design had produced something so fragile. He ordered the windows open to let in fresh air, which chilled the baby. He ordered sacrifices to every god in the pantheon. He began planning a presentation ceremony for the following week, convinced that the sheer force of his will could make the child strong. But will cannot inflate collapsed lungs. For 10 days, the baby lingered. He lived in a twilight state, never fully waking, never fully sleeping. Amestris sat by his cradle day and night. She watched him fade. She saw the life leaking out of him, breath by shallow breath. She fed him drops of milk from her finger, humming quiet lullabies, the same songs her mother had sung to her in the safety of the harem. She bonded with him in the shadow of death. They were two victims holding on to each other in the dark. Artabanus paced. He raged. He brought in more doctors, who forced more tonics down the infant's throat, making him choke. Amestris wanted to scream at them to stop, to let him go in peace. But she had no voice in this house. On the 10th night, the struggle ended. Amestris was holding him when it happened. One moment, he was breathing a soft, rhythmic rasp. The next moment, there was silence. Absolute, final silence. She waited. She waited for the next breath. It never came. She didn't scream. She didn't call for the guards. She just sat there, rocking the small, still bundle, tears streaming silently down her face. She felt a strange, terrible mixture of sorrow and relief. He is safe, she thought. He is gone. He will never know this cage. He will never be used by his father. He is free. When Artabanus entered the room an hour later and saw the stillness, he didn't weep. He froze. He looked at the dead child, and then he looked at Amestris. And in his eyes, the grief instantly curdled into something else, something blacker. He didn't see a tragedy of nature. He didn't see a weak infant succumbing to a hard birth. He saw sabotage. He saw a mother who had hated her pregnancy. He saw a wife who had prayed to be barren. The thought bloomed in his paranoid mind like a poisonous flower. She did this. He didn't say it aloud. Not yet. But the look he gave her was a declaration of war. The fragility of the child was gone, replaced by the granite hardness of the father's hate. The baby was dead. The heir was gone. The silent cage was empty of hope, and now it was filling up with danger. Grief is a heavy stone, but suspicion is a sharp knife. When a child dies, a house usually unites in sorrow. Parents hold each other in the dark, finding solace in shared pain. But in the house of Artabanus, the death of the heir did not bring the parents together. It turned them into combatants in a silent, deadly war. The funeral for the infant was small. It had to be. In the Zoroastrian faith, a body that has ceased to live is considered nasu, unclean, touched by the decay demon. There were no grand processions through the streets of Persepolis. The child who was meant to be the future of the empire was taken away by silent priests to a tower of silence, his short life erased as if he had never existed. For Amestris, the days following the death were a blur of numbness. She lay in her bed, staring at the empty cradle that still stood in the corner of the room. Her body ached with the ghost of the pregnancy, her breasts painful and full of milk for a child who would never drink it, her womb cramping as it shrank back to emptiness. It was a physical reminder of her failure, a cruel biological joke. But while she lay in the wreckage of her motherhood, the whispers began. They started in the servants' quarters. Servants see everything, but they understand only half of what they see. They had seen the princess melancholy during the pregnancy. They had seen her stare out the window with dead eyes. They had heard her weeping in the night, not with joy, but with despair. And now, the baby was dead. She didn't want him, a kitchen maid whispered to a guard. I saw her looking at the belly like it was a curse, a laundress added. Perhaps she helped him die? The rumor was absurd. Amestris had held that child for 10 days, fighting for his life with every ounce of her strength. But rumors do not need truth to survive. They only need oxygen. And the oxygen in this house was fear. The servants were terrified of Artabanus' wrath. If the baby died of natural causes, it was a tragedy. But if the baby was murdered, then there was a villain. And if there was a villain, the general's rage would have a target that wasn't them. So they fed the fire, they embellished the stories, they remembered glances that never happened and words that were never spoken. Artabanus heard the whispers. In fact, he sought them out. His mind had snapped. The death of the child had broken the last tether holding his sanity to the shore of reason. He was an old man who had bet his entire life on this one gamble, and he had lost. He could not accept that it was bad luck. He could not accept that his seed was weak. His ego, fragile and monstrous, demanded a culprit. She did it, the voice in his head hissed. She hated you. She hated the marriage. She killed your son to spite you. It became his truth. He looked back at the last year, her coldness, her silence, her refusal to smile, and he reinterpreted it all as a long, premeditated campaign of sabotage. She wasn't a victim. She was a witch. The change in the atmosphere was immediate. Artabanus stopped visiting her quarters. Instead, he sent guards. He replaced the eunuchs who had been with her men who had perhaps grown too sympathetic with new, harder men. Mercenaries from the Scythian borders who didn't speak her language and didn't care about her rank. Then, the interrogations began. He didn't question her directly. That would be beneath him. He questioned her staff. He summoned her personal maid, the mute woman who had brought her the pomegranates, and had her beaten until she confessed to seeing a mistress neglect the child. The confession was a lie, extracted through pain, but to Artabanus, it was gospel. Armed with this proof, the violence moved from the shadows into the light. It started with small cruelties. The food sent to her room became scarce, stale bread, water that tasted of mud. The fire in her hearth was let to go out, leaving her shivering in the winter chill. The physicians were dismissed. There were no more tonics, no more care. She was left to recover from the birth alone, bleeding and feverish in the dark. Then came the first physical confrontation. It was late at night. Artabanus burst into her room, smelling of heavy wine and unwashed sweat. He looked wild, his eyes rimmed with red, his beard unkempt. He stood over her bed, blocking the moonlight. "You are pleased, aren't you?" he rasped. Amestris shrank back against the headboard, pulling the covers up to her chin. "My lord? You are pleased he is dead. You are pleased my line is broken." "No," she whispered, tears springing to her eyes. "He was my son too. I loved him." "Liar!" The blow was sudden. His open hand struck her across the face with the force of a hammer. Amestris cried out, falling sideways onto the pillows. The taste of copper filled her mouth. Her lip was split. "Do not lie to me, witch!" Artabanus screamed, looming over her. "You smothered him. You let the cold take him. You think I don't know? You think I don't see the hate in your black heart?" He grabbed her by the hair, dragging her face close to his. His breath was hot and foul. "You owe me a life, Amestris. You destroyed my heir. You will give me another. And this time, if he dies, you die with him." He threw her back onto the mattress and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the wall shook. Amestris lay in the dark, touching her bleeding lip. The physical pain was sharp, throbbing in time with her heart. But the terror was colder. He believed it. He truly believed she was a murderess. And a man who believes he is punishing a criminal feels no guilt for his cruelty. The abuse became systematic. It was not always violent. Sometimes it was psychological. He would come into her room and sit in a chair, watching her for hours without speaking, cleaning his dagger with a piece of silk. He would describe in graphic detail the punishments reserved for traitors in the Persian law: flaying, impalement, the boats. He would talk about how easy it would be for a woman to fall down a flight of stairs, or choke on a piece of meat. "Accidents happen," he would say softly, "especially to clumsy girls." Amestris began to deteriorate. The silent cage had become a torture chamber. She stopped eating, partly because the food was rotten, but mostly because her stomach was knotted in perpetual fear. She grew skeletal. Her cheekbones jutted out like blades. Her eyes sank into dark hollows. The beauty that had once captivated the court was gone, replaced by the haunted look of a starving animal. She tried to dissociate again, to retreat into that fortress in her mind. But pain has a way of pulling you back to reality. Every slap, every rough grab of her arm, every night spent shivering in the cold kept her anchored in the nightmare. She realized, with a clarity that was both liberating and terrifying, that she was going to die here. Artabanus wasn't going to stop. He needed an heir, yes, but he hated her too much to touch her now. He was paralyzed by his own conflicting madness. He needed her body for a son, but he revulsed at her treachery. So he punished her, waiting for her to break, waiting for her to confess, waiting for something. And the world outside? The world outside went on. Xerxes sat on his throne in Persepolis, drinking his wine, planning new monuments. He sent no messengers. He asked no questions. In his mind, the transaction was complete. His daughter was married. His general was loyal. He had bought his peace. He did not want to know the cost. Occasionally, rumors would drift back to the palace, whispers from servants who traveled between the estates. "The princess looks ill," someone would say. "The general is hard on her," another would murmur. But the court chose blindness. It is uncomfortable to look at the suffering of a princess. because it reminds the powerful of their own complicity. So they looked away. They talked of the harvest, of the new taxes, of the weather. They let the silence swallow her. Amestris, alone in the dark, understood this. She stopped waiting for rescue. She stopped praying to Anahita. She stopped hoping. One night, sitting by the window, looking at the same indifferent moon, she made a decision. It wasn't a plan, she had no power to plan, but it was a shift in her soul. If I am to die, she thought, touching the bruises on her arm, I will not die crying. She stopped weeping. She stopped begging him to believe her. When he came into the room to torment her, she met his gaze with dead, flat eyes. She became a mirror, reflecting his own ugliness back at him. This infuriated him, but it also unsettled him. He was used to fear. He didn't know what to do with emptiness. The poison of suspicion had done its work. It had killed the marriage, it had killed the trust, and it was slowly killing the woman. But poison, if taken in small doses over a long time, can sometimes create an immunity. Or, in Amestra's case, it can create a creature that is no longer capable of feeling pain. She was becoming a ghost in her own life. And ghosts, as Artabanus would soon learn, are very difficult to kill. Time in the ancient world was not measured in hours or minutes, but in the slow, grinding erosion of dynasties. 14 years passed. 14 years of silence in the house of Artabanus. 14 years where the sun rose over the Zagros mountains and set over the vast, crumbling edges of the Persian Empire. It was now the summer of 465 BC. The world had changed. The fire that had once burned in the heart of Xerxes, the fire that had driven him to bridge the Hellespont and burn Athens, had turned into cold ash. The King of Kings was no longer a conqueror. He was a relic. He spent his days in the harem, surrounded by sycophants, distracted by petty intrigues and building projects that drained the treasury. The empire was stagnating. The satraps were restless. The grain prices were rising. The mask of Persepolis was peeling, revealing the rot underneath. And in the shadows, waiting with the patience of a spider that has spent a decade weaving its web, was Artabanus. The general was now an old man, his hair white as bone, his face a landscape of deep fissures. But age had not softened him. It had distilled him. He was no longer just ambitious. He was messianic. He believed that he was the only thing holding the empire together. He looked at Xerxes and saw a weak, indulgent fool who was steering the ship of state into the rocks. He looked at the crown prince, Darius, and saw a young copy of the father, arrogant and unproven. Artabanus realized that his plan to marry into the bloodline had failed. Amestris had not given him an heir. She had given him only silence and a dead infant. The biological path to the throne was closed. That left only the iron path. The coup did not begin with a shout. It began with a whisper. Artabanus found an ally in Aspametres, the chief eunuch of the palace. Aspametres was the man who guarded the king's door, the man who tasted his food, the man who knew the rhythm of the king's breath. Together, they formed a conspiracy born of mutual contempt for their master. But every coup needs a justification. You cannot simply kill a god-king without a narrative. You need a story that makes the murder look like justice. And here, Artabanus displayed a cynicism that was truly breathtaking. He used Amestris. He began to whisper to the other conspirators, generals, priests, dissatisfied nobles about the king's cruelty. He spoke of how Xerxes had sold his own daughter into a miserable marriage to pay a debt of vanity. He spoke of the suffering of the princess, painting himself not as her jailer, but as a witness to her tragedy. The king eats his own children. Artabanus would murmur over cups of wine in the dark corners of the barracks. He sacrificed Amestris to save his pride. What will he sacrifice next? Your lands? Your sons? It was a grotesque inversion of the truth. The man who had beaten and starved Amestris was now using her bruises as propaganda to justify killing her father. He weaponized her victimization to fuel his own ascent. And the court, hungry for change, chose to believe him. The night of the assassination was stiflingly hot. It was August, the month of fire. The palace was quiet, the heavy curtains hanging motionless in the stagnant air. Xerxes had retired to his bedchamber after a night of heavy drinking. He was asleep, snoring softly, surrounded by the luxury that had defined and destroyed his reign. Artabanus and Aspametres moved through the corridors like smoke. They carried no torches. They needed no light. They knew the anatomy of power better than anyone. They bypassed the immortals, the elite guards, because Artabanus commanded the immortals. The very system designed to protect the king was now the weapon turned against him. They entered the royal bedchamber. The smell of frankincense was overpowering, masking the scent of the impending violence. Xerxes lay on his bed, his limbs sprawled, vulnerable. He looked human, without the crown, without the robes, without the throne. He was just an aging man with a soft belly and a tired heart. Artabanus stood over him for a moment. Did he feel hesitation? Did he remember the days when he had served Darius, this man's father? Did he feel the weight of the oath he was about to break? History suggests he felt nothing but the cold clarity of execution. Aspameters held the king's arms. Artabanus drew his dagger, a short, curved blade of Hyrcanian steel. Xerxes woke in the final second. He opened his eyes and saw the face of his most trusted servant hovering above him. He saw the glint of metal. He opened his mouth to scream, perhaps to call for the guards, perhaps to ask why. But the blade was faster. It was a messy, brutal business. Regicide is rarely clean. The struggle was short. The King of Kings, the man who had whipped the sea, died choking on his own blood in the dark, betrayed by the two men closest to him. Artabanus wiped his blade on the royal sheets. He did not tremble. He felt a surge of adrenaline, a rush of power so intense it was almost sexual. He had done it. He had killed the sun. But the night was not over. A king was dead, but there were still princes. Artabanus left the body and went straight to the quarters of Artaxerxes, the king's younger son. Artaxerxes was barely 18, a boy raised in the harem, impressionable and easily manipulated. Artabanus woke him with feigned terror, his hands covered in the blood of the king, which he claimed was from trying to save him. "Your brother," Artabanus cried, putting on the performance of his life. "Darius has gone mad. He has murdered your father to take the throne. He is coming for you next." It was a lie of monumental proportions, but fear makes men stupid. Artaxerxes, panicked and grieving, believed the old general. He believed the man who had been the pillar of the state for decades. "What must I do?" the young prince stammered. "Strike first," Artabanus whispered. "Justice demands blood." And so, the tragedy compounded. Artaxerxes, guided by Artabanus, led the guards to his older brother's room. Darius, innocent of the crime, was accused, condemned, and executed before the sun even rose. By morning, the house of Achaemenes was decapitated. The king was dead. The crown prince was dead. And the new king, Artaxerxes I, was a terrified teenager who looked to Artabanus as his savior. For 7 months, Artabanus was the true ruler of the world. He did not sit on the throne, but he stood in its shadow. He dictated the decrees, he moved the armies, he controlled the treasury. He was the regent, the Hazarapat, the power behind the curtain. He had achieved the ultimate ambition of the courtier. He had become the master of his masters. He felt invincible. He began to plan his final move, the removal of young Artaxerxes and the establishment of a new dynasty, the Hyrcanian dynasty. He saw himself as the correction to a historical error, the strong hand that would save Persia from the weak blood of the Achaemenids. But hubris is a blinding light. Artabanus forgot one thing, the resilience of the bloodline he sought to extinguish, and he underestimated the young king. Artaxerxes might have been young, but he was not deaf. Whispers travel fast in a palace built on secrets. A loyal general, Megabyzus, who had married one of Xerxes' daughters, approached the young king. He told him the truth. He told him about the dagger, about the lie, about the betrayal. The realization hit Artaxerxes like a physical blow. The man he called father was the murderer of his real father. The confrontation happened in the throne room. It was not a battle of armies, but a duel of assassins. Artabanus entered the hall, expecting to give orders. Instead, he found Artaxerxes waiting for him, sword drawn. The sources vary on the details. Some say Artabanus struck first, wounding the king. Others say Artaxerxes, fueled by the rage of an orphan, cut the old man down before he could draw his weapon. Whatever the choreography, the result was the same. Artabanus, the kingslayer, the architect of pain, fell. He died on the cold stone floor of the palace he had tried to steal, his blood mingling with the dust of the dynasty he had served and betrayed. News of the death traveled slowly down the royal road. It passed through the checkpoints, through the markets, and finally, it reached the iron gates of the estate where the ghost of a princess lived. It was late afternoon. A mistress was sitting in her usual chair, staring at the wall. She was 28 years old now, but she looked 50. Her hair was streaked with premature gray. Her hands were thin and trembling. A servant entered the room. It was not one of the guards. They had fled hours ago, sensing the shift in the wind. It was the old mute woman. She walked up to Amestris and placed a hand on her shoulder. "He is dead," the servant signed, her movements jerky with excitement. "The general is dead. The king has killed him." Amestris did not move. She did not blink. For a long time, the words hung in the air, meaningless sounds. Dead? The monster was dead? Slowly, the reality began to seep into the cracks of her mind. The man who had bought her, caged her, raped her, and tortured her was gone. The weight that had pressed on her chest for 14 years was suddenly lifted. She should have felt joy. She should have felt triumph. But all she felt was a vast, echoing emptiness. The death of Artabanus did not bring back her baby. It did not bring back her youth. It did not undo the nights of terror. It was just an ending. She stood up. Her legs felt weak. She walked to the window and threw open the shutters he had ordered sealed so many years ago. The light flooded in, harsh and blinding. She breathed in the air. It smelled of dust and cypress, just as it always had. The tyrant was dead. The king, her brother, had won. But as Amestris looked out at the world that had forgotten her, she realized the terrible truth of trauma. The war was over, but the ruins remained. You cannot rebuild a city that has been salted. You can only live in the rubble. And now, the doors of her cage were open. But did she even remember how to fly? The gates of Artabanus' estate opened, not to let a prisoner out, but to let a ghost leave. When the royal carriage arrived to retrieve the Princess Amestris, the soldiers of the new king, Xerxes, expected to find a woman in distress, perhaps weeping with relief. Instead, they found a void. The woman who walked out of the dark stone house was 28 years old, but she moved with the fragility of a centenarian. Her eyes, once the bright, curious eyes of a dancer, were now matte and unreflective, like coins that had been rubbed smooth by too many thumbs. The journey back to Persepolis was a reversal of that doomed ride 14 years earlier. But while the landscape had remained the same, the dusty plains, the heat shimmering off the road, the distant purple bruise of the mountains, the traveler had been hollowed out. Entering the great palace was a sensory assault. The smell of jasmine, the sound of water trickling in the fountains, the vibrant colors of the glazed bricks, it all rushed at her with the violence of a memory she had tried to kill. This was the place where she had been a child. This was the place where she had danced. This was the place where her father had sold her. King Artaxerxes received her in the Hall of 100 Columns. He was young, barely 20, flush with the victory of having reclaimed his throne and avenged his father. He looked at his half-sister with a mixture of pity and discomfort. He wanted to be the hero of this story. He wanted to be the benevolent brother who restored order to the universe. "You are home, sister," he declared, descending from the throne to embrace her. "The usurper is dead. Your honor is restored. You shall have the finest apartments in the harem, double the allowance of gold, and servants who will obey your every whisper." He offered her luxury as if it were medicine. He believed, with the naivety of a man who has never known true powerlessness, that trauma could be patched over with silk and jewels. He thought that if he filled her room with enough flowers, she would forget the smell of the cage. But Amestris did not want gold. She did not want servants. She accepted his embrace, but her body remained rigid, cold to the touch. "Thank you, brother," she whispered. Her voice was rusty, unused. She was installed in a suite of rooms overlooking the eastern gardens. It was a paradise. The walls were painted with scenes of birds and trees. The floors were covered in thick Bactrian carpets. But to Amestris, it was just another box. A prettier box, yes, but a box nonetheless. The restoration of her status was absolute. She was once again the daughter of Xerxes. The court bowed to her. Satraps sent gifts, but she walked among them like a specter at a feast. She rarely spoke. She rejected invitations to banquets. She spent her days sitting in the shadows of the colonnades, watching the court life swirl around her, the intrigues, the flirtations, the ambitions with the detachment of someone watching a play in a language they do not speak. She had survived the monster, but the monster had taken her capacity to live. The court physicians, baffled by her lingering melancholy, prescribed music. "The soul is out of rhythm," they told the king. "It must be tuned like a harp." And so, the final tragedy occurred on a warm autumn evening. Artaxerxes, desperate to see his sister smile, organized a small, intimate gathering in the garden. He ordered the finest musicians in the empire to play. The air was sweet with the scent of night-blooming flowers. The wine was poured. For a moment, it seemed peaceful. Amestris sat on a cushioned divan, staring into the middle distance, holding a cup she had not sipped. Then, the lead musician began a new song. It was a popular melody from the previous reign, a tune that had been fashionable during the Great Victory celebrations, and during the great banquets of 479 BC. As the first notes of the harp floated through the air, delicate, rippling, hypnotic, something in Amestris snapped. It was not a gradual realization. It was a lightning strike. The sound transported her instantly back to the Apadana. She smelled the roast meat. She felt the heat of the torches. She saw her father's drunken, smiling face. She felt the silk of her dancing dress, and she heard the voice of Artabanus claiming her. The past crashed into the present with the force of a physical blow. Amestris stood up. The movement was so abrupt that she knocked over a table of wine, the red liquid splashing onto the white marble like a fresh wound. "Stop!" she screamed. The music died instantly. The guests froze. "Stop it! Stop it!" She wasn't looking at the musicians. She was looking at the air, clawing at her own ears as if to tear the sound out of her head. Then, she lunged. She grabbed the harp from the terrified musician's hands and smashed it against a stone pillar. The wood splintered with a sickening crack. The strings groaned and snapped. She fell to her knees among the wreckage of the instrument, wailing. It was a sound that didn't belong in a palace. It was a feral, guttural howl of pure, distilled anguish. It was the sound of 14 years of silence finally finding a way out. "He sold me," she shrieked, rocking back and forth, her hands bleeding from the splinters. "He sold me for a promise. He is still here. Can't you see him? He is still here." The king rushed to her, terrified. He tried to hold her, but she flinched away from him as if he were burning. She didn't see a brother. She saw another man with a crown, another man with power, another man who could hurt her. She was carried back to her room, sedated with opium, and put to bed. But the Amestris who woke up the next day was not the same. The outburst had drained the last of her vital energy. She had expended the final reserve of her spirit in that act of destruction. After that night, she began to fade in earnest. She refused to leave her bed. She refused food. It wasn't a hunger strike in the political sense. It was a simple, quiet rejection of sustenance. Eating required an will to live, and she had none left. The physicians tried to force-feed her broths and honey, but she would simply turn her head away, closing her mouth like a sealed tomb. Her body, already frail, began to consume itself. The flesh melted from her bones. Her skin became translucent, stretched tight over her skull. Xerxes would come to her bedside and weep, begging her to eat, begging her to live. "Why?" he asked her one day, holding her skeletal hand. "You are free. You are safe. Why do you do this?" Amestris opened her eyes. They were huge in her wasted face, filled with a terrible, lucid clarity. "I am not here," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "I died the day he took my hand. This is just the echo." She died in 457 BC, 8 years after her liberation. At the age of 36, there was no struggle at the end. She simply went to sleep and forgot to wake up. The physicians recorded the cause of death as wasting sickness or melancholy. They did not have the words for what truly killed her: the slow, corrosive accumulation of betrayal. She was buried in a royal tomb cut into the rock face of Naqsh-e-Rustam, not far from her father. The inscriptions list her lineage, her titles, and her proximity to the throne. They speak of the glory of the Achaemenids. They do not mention the cage. They do not mention the dead baby. They do not mention the price she paid for her father's vanity. History is a curator. It chooses what to save and what to discard. It saves the battles, the treaties, the monuments, and the names of kings. It discards the silence of the victims. It forgets the women who were used as mortar to build the walls of empire. Amestris is not a famous figure. You will not find her face on a coin. Most textbooks do not even know her name. But her story is not just a footnote. It is a mirror. When we look at the tragedy of Amestris, we are forced to look at the dark underbelly of power. We are forced to see that the great kings of history were often small, frightened men who would burn their own families to keep themselves warm. We are reminded that domestic violence does not just happen in cottages. It happens in palaces, sanctioned by law and sanctified by religion. Her life asks us a question that echoes across 2,500 years. What is the cost of glory? And who pays it? Amestris paid it. She paid it with her youth, her body, her mind, and her life. And today, by telling her story, by pulling her name out of the shadows and speaking it aloud, we offer her the one thing her father, her husband, and her empire never did. We offer her a voice. If this story touched you, if you felt the weight of the silence in the House of Artabanus, please like this video and share it. History is full of forgotten ghosts waiting to be heard. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next journey into the hidden past. Together, let's keep the candle burning for those who lived in the dark.